His name was Jang-chul, and he was an ordinary graduate student from Korea. In other words, you could say he used to be just that, but now everything has changed, because yesterday he unexpectedly became Kratos, the Demon King and final boss of the game Jang-chul loved to play. The goal of the game, Blood Paladin, was to revive an ancient hero who had been sleeping an eternal sleep, but Jang-chul thought that even if he told the whole story, nothing would make sense. A short while later, another demon arrived, intending to report something to Kratos. Zephyros, an advisor to the Demon King, who was at level 15, announced that all preparations for war were complete. Assurant, who was at level 534, said it was time to finally put an end to the Great Famine. Sergi, who was the Cold Monarch, declared that these lands were unfit for life, and that was why they had been forced to devour their own kin. Hartok was at the highest level, 555, and he had no objection to the extermination of both humans and elves. And the Ogre Ball, who was at level 539, added that only their bones should remain. Shortly thereafter, the entire army gathered, and their king summoned them to address them. As their king, he ordered his generals to stop this at any cost. Kratos said that they would stop the attack right then and there, and start farming instead. Of course, none of these generals were happy to hear something like that from their king, especially since it didn't seem like him at all. Kratos himself even stepped back when he saw how terrifying they were now, when they were really angry, so he took a few steps back. Meanwhile, a background character named Old Kimchi, who was nearly level 10,000, had already woken up, and Kratos knew that if they attacked the people, he himself wouldn't be able to survive. Jang Cheol enrolled in a graduate program in agriculture, with the goal of getting rich through farming, and since he was smart, he quickly became the leader of the entire class. Many recognized his intelligence and asked him to include their ideas in his thesis, saying it would help. Most people tried to befriend him so that he would help with various projects. They also turned to him whenever there was work to be done in the field, thinking he could handle absolutely everything. But in the end, all that intelligence and willingness to help turned Yang Cheol into a first-class slave for everyone around him. He was exhausted and no longer knew the point of such a life, since it was Jang-chul who did all the work, yet all the credit went to the professors. His dopamine levels were already at the breaking point, and so the young man began to slowly lose his mind, not knowing what to do next. And this game was the only source from which he drew strength. With its help, Jang-chul could find peace when he was alone. It was incredibly difficult to level up in it, because no player had ever made it past the 20th attempt, since the difficulty always increased. Oleg was so desperate to win that he played it non-stop, and it took countless attempts to finally succeed. He eventually became the first player to defeat the Blood Paladin 19 times, and finally achieved the victory he'd been seeking. Jang Cheol already knew that the next attempt would be even harder, but before moving on to that, he wanted to raise his level even higher, even though he was already the strongest. He opened the interface to look at his character and his equipment again. The maximum level was 9,999, so he realized he should stop, since it had taken him many years to reach it. But despite this, the boy simply couldn't stop and press the joystick again to start the game. However, something happened that he definitely didn't expect, and his soul literally flew out of him. Immediately after that, it flew straight into the TV he had been playing on the whole time. Jang Cheol had no idea what was going on, but he tried to calm himself by thinking that he wasn't stupid and could do something. He thought about how his spirit had left his body, and logically, since he'd fallen, he wouldn't die. At least, that's what he hoped. Then, among the other main characters, he saw the Tower of Life, and judging by everything, he realized he'd ended up in the very game he'd played so much. The boy also pondered the fact that he would become a hero who had almost reached the maximum level, and would finally be invincible and the strongest in the whole world. He had literally flown right up to his character, who was lying there peacefully at that moment. But immediately after that, he was transported to yet another place, even though he had no idea what was going on there. Right after that, he saw Kratos, who was sitting on the throne at that moment, and the boy began to protest, saying that he didn't want to possess him. In the present, the main character thought that if he hadn't had that stupid idea back then, he would now be living peacefully as the strongest character. Also, all the other generals, gathered around the table, began discussing how their king had become too weak and wanted to rebel against him, and then divide the power among themselves. Hartok heard all this, and said that perhaps the others were mistaken, for 2 of the 4 would either suffer fatal wounds or be destroyed immediately. The Sergi suggested that if Azurant himself offered to be their shield, they could try, but he refused. After all, he wanted to live, and said they should first find proof that their lord was no longer so strong, and only then decide what to do next. If he managed to find this proof, they would simply be obligated to get rid of him. Baal thought only of the fact that they would finally be able to stop feeding him. Immediately after that, it was reported that the fighting spirit of the entire army had been completely broken. Zephyros approached the Lord, saying that incidents of monsters attacking one another had increased, and that some residents had begun leaving the lands without warning. The 4 demonic generals were incredibly angry, and believed their king had become too weak, so they planned to unite to destroy him. Kratos was now thinking that if those 4 attacked at the same time, he definitely wouldn't be able to withstand it. But at that very moment, he began to think about what had happened to his character, Old Kimchi. Since he hadn't possessed him, the character would likely still be wandering around somewhere, and in that case, invading the human world would be a much better option. At the same time, Zephyros showed a video from the Paladin's tomb that General Ogmia had sent, and approaching with this sphere, he prepared to play the video. In reality, a very powerful and brutal battle was taking place there, filled with screams, so Kratos simply fell silent, watching it all. He saw that the one who did this was his character, Stare Kimchi, and that he was the very brutal hero who had destroyed everyone. To Kratos, it all seemed like the work of a madman, so he didn't want to cross paths with his character and wanted to stay here by any means necessary. However, at this rate, regardless of whether he showed weakness or decided to flee, the 4 generals would still want to destroy him, and if he interfered in the human world, Old Kimchi would simply blind him and then destroy him afterward. He simply saw no other way out, so he just wanted to solve the problem with food supplies and told Zephyros that he wanted to find a place to grow certain things. Zephyros was actually very surprised by what she had just heard from this self-obsessed, arrogant, and perfect creature who had no manners or sense of apology, and she added that it was simply awful, so she told him not to do that again. Kratos didn't know that this advisor only appears once in the game before the battle with the Demon King, but it was precisely because of this moment that he gained great popularity. Of course, when John Shield played this game, he was able to defeat this character, which is why players were convinced that the advisor was loyal to the king, or, at the very least, held him in such high regard that he was willing to protect him at the cost of his own life. This time, the advisor said that the king's mistake was unprecedented, since he had never seen the Lord in such a state, but that trust in him could be lost very soon. Zephyros also asked if the king wanted to start farming on demon territory, and began writing everything down, but Kratos finally exclaimed that the King of Darkness himself stood before him, so he ordered them not to forget this. The advisor said that Kratos himself and previous rulers had already tried to plant at least something here, but nothing grew due to the extreme temperature fluctuation, which is why these lands are unsuitable for cultivation. The king merely said that thanks to his abilities, this land could be revived, and even though Jan Chul hated farming, he understood that he had to survive. That's why he started acting out and looked more like a worthless creature devouring the earth. But when Zephyros began to record this, Kratos looked at him in irritation, asking what on earth he was doing. Zephyros said he was simply fulfilling his obligations, since this was an important part of his duty. At that moment, Kratos thought to himself that his advisor was very irritable. In any case, there were no nutrients in this soil, including nitrogen, which was why nothing grew here. Nitrogen was the substance that was essential for growing anything, and the plants weren't in a condition to absorb nitrogen from the air on their own. Even though it was the largest component of the entire atmosphere, the nitrogen atoms were too dense for them to absorb. Kratos realized that now he would have to somehow carry out the process of nitrogen fixation under normal conditions. Then he thought of lightning, and remembered that King Kratos' primary skill is the bloody strike. Realizing that this might help, he decided to try it and struck his own hand with his claws. Of course, it was incredibly painful, and the boy thought that Kratos was a complete idiot for using it every time when it hurt so much. The other 4 generals stood behind a tree and watched what was happening, thinking that their king had finally become a weakling. Zephyros also said that he had definitely become weaker, and Kratos thought that this must be some kind of hidden enemy who would soon want to destroy him. But in any case, he had to survive somehow, so the protagonist tried to use this attack with all his strength. They all came closer, asking if everything was okay and how he was feeling now. Meanwhile, the main character's alter ego, Old Kimchi, stood atop the mountain and gazed out at the world. He had only a few memories left of his past lives, and he felt that he had surely lived through this moment a dozen times, and each time he had been led to this very place. Yet now the boy didn't even understand what he was living for, even though he was the strongest among all who existed here. Assurance simply stepped closer, saying that the law of demons dictates that only the strongest can be the ruler. And Yang Cheol, in the body of Kratos, thought only that they were truly incredibly terrifying, and moreover, very strong, and pondered that this was the end, since he couldn't even use his own ability. Asura felt intense pressure, even though the fight hadn't started yet, but he was already concentrating his power so much that his body was burning up. That's why he asked if the king could defeat absolutely all of them in such a duel, but the others were hiding behind a tree, afraid to come out. She said they would just watch as these two fought, and if the chance arose, they would join in. According to demon traditions, the fight continues until one or both die, and surrender is absolutely forbidden. Asura thought only that he could win, since their king had, after all, grown weaker. Credo was already very nervous at this point, because he didn't know what to do, even though he knew he had recently tested his physical strength. After all, the Lord of Demons must be strong, and though he was stronger than a human, there was nothing to boast about here. By this time, Asura had already begun attacking him with his sword, and although the boy had encountered such moves in the game, now it was completely different. In real life, he didn't know if he could dodge such precise strikes, so he was nervous. But Kratos still tried to do something, closely watching his opponent's every move, and thought that since his foot was pointed forward, he would make his next lunge. At that very moment, he managed to dodge, and Hartok said that Kratos' face was very focused as he dodged, as if he were ready to destroy his opponent right then and there. Jang Cheol, because when he first faced Asura, was shocked. He didn't even know if it was possible to defeat such a fast character, and his movements were unpredictable, just like the number of attacks. It took him a total of 128 attempts to finally defeat this demon for the first time, and eventually, over the next 19 attempts, he was able to do so effortlessly. Recalling all this, Kratos thought that Asura would probably no longer be able to touch him. Everyone else continued to sit behind the tree and watch everything happening on the battlefield. Kratos finally began to feel relieved, thinking that he would be able to win and survive, and he was also able to understand the laws of this world, since they completely matched the game's rules. There was a specific target lock-on that appeared when using a special skill, and that was why he used it. After that, the king used the Bloody Strike, finally defeating his opponent and even burning his clothes. It turned out that Asura managed to survive even after a direct hit from the Bloody Strike, though no one should have been able to survive that. But Kratos remembered that his opponent had incredibly fast regeneration, which was helping him. Asura simply couldn't die from the pain, but their lord continued to torment him, which greatly frightened the other three generals. After that, the protagonist checked his inventory and saw that it contained only the items he was currently wearing, and there was absolutely nothing that could help him now. Credo moved closer to Asura and realized he didn't have enough strength to destroy his regeneration. This man's regenerative abilities were at their peak, so after a while, he would simply come back to life again. After a while, he realized that as long as his opponent was still alive, he could avoid targeting him and use the Bloody Strike a second time. They began to worry even more, but Kratos told Sergei to tie him up, which she didn't particularly like. But in the end, she had no other choice, so they took the first step. They set up a lightning rod. Before long, Asura had fully recovered and was ready to go into battle against Kratos again, still unaware that he was tied up. Immediately after that, the demon launched another Bloody Strike and attacked his opponent once more. Shortly thereafter, Hartok approached, and Kratos ordered him to cover the entire area with fog so thick that even their clothes became wet. The demon thought the king wanted to humidify the air so much that the lightning strikes would hurt even more, and Hartok realized that this was a stroke of genius and that he could learn something from it today as well. Of course he carried out this order, and Kratos was overjoyed, realizing that thanks to this, he would be able to properly enrich the soil with nitrogen and grow a bountiful harvest just as he had hoped. Then the king began to check on the progress, but for farming to go perfectly, they needed loose soil with a granular structure. But he also returned to the others and told them that they urgently needed fertilizer, and they were surprised by his request. Meanwhile, old Kimchi was walking through the forest, trying to find at least something, but suddenly he heard someone's voice calling for help. There were two men there, one of whom had broken his leg, and they explained that they had been attacked by a horde of goblins, which is why they were asking for help, promising a reward. Of course, he immediately approached them and helped by carrying the wounded man on his shoulders, even though these two strangers didn't trust him very much, not knowing who he was. Old Kimchi asked them to show him the way so they could get out to the city. The injured man said he was a messenger named Reviask Azrahan, and behind him walked his servant, named Dioel Frontera. The two men began asking who their savior was, but old Kimchi simply replied that that was exactly what he needed to find out right now. Meanwhile, all three generals sat at the table, pondering what their lord had compelled them to do. To all of them, this was incredibly strange, but he understood that if they couldn't produce fertilizer, they couldn't supply their own either. He didn't want that either, so he suggested grabbing a few low-ranking demons and forcing them to do it themselves. Eventually, they burst into the apartment of one of them, and he begged them to at least step outside, but they didn't listen. Hartok also followed them in, saying they had plenty of time, so he demanded results. He approached one of these demons, saying that he didn't care about anything, and that the demon had to carry out their order, but the demon replied that he hadn't eaten anything in a long time. Eventually, Hartok got angry and grabbed the demon by the neck, intending to do it himself. Only Baal was able to stop him, grabbing the demon's arm and telling him to stop. Baal argued that if this demon didn't live, they wouldn't get what they needed, so he said that destroying him wasn't the best option. These were indeed logical arguments, and he said that feeding them would be better, but after that, Hartok and Baal started fighting. Fortunately, it didn't last long, because their master walked in shortly after. Kratos said that they shouldn't use these demons, and needed to find other fertilizers for their purposes. Usually various weeds or eggshells from the black soil and the like are used as these fertilizers. All of this can be done using those old abandoned buildings, so only the eggshells remain, and they also needed to find a chicken. The demon thought that he could get absolutely everything from this, since they still had a way to get there. Meanwhile, he also recalled that in the game, they flew in flocks over human lands, so he concluded that they must be feeding on something there, since they spend so much time there. Zephyros said they could try to find demonic seagulls and use them instead of chicken. He also explained that this place is called a cliff from which no one has ever returned, and there isn't a single ledge to grab onto, and if you fall, you'll inevitably be swept away by the raging waves. Kratos replied that he knew this better than anyone, that this place was almost completely inaccessible to players, but he had still managed to do something. Since ancient times, many brave people have tried to catch at least one seagull, but everyone has met only their end here. He also mentioned that as soon as he jumps in, he'll shed his shell and gather everything else they need into a whole bag, and his assistant's task was to catch him. Eventually, after some time, he got close, already preparing to jump. Even though he had already tried absolutely every possible way in the game to get there. He no longer knew how much time he'd spent on it, or how many attempts he'd made, but nothing good had ever come of it. Despite this, Kratos decided to try one more time, and finally, by leaping forward, he managed to do it after all. He had found a glitch. Everyone else watched him very closely, holding their breath, because they were curious to see what would come of it. At that very moment, Kratos quickly opened his inventory and showed everyone everything he had at that moment. Immediately after that, he took off absolutely everything, recalling the very same glitch he had managed to find. And what the other 4 demons saw shocked them even more. They didn't even know how to react to it, but literally a few seconds later, Kratos opened his inventory again and put everything he had back on. They still didn't understand what was happening, but while they all stood there in shock, Baal decided to help his king, thinking that he would definitely feed them. Despite Zephyrus' attempts to stop him, the ogre quickly lunged forward, trying to leap toward his king, but immediately began to fall. Fortunately, Kratos managed to catch him with his hand, and even though it was very difficult for him, he continued to hold Baal. Only at the last moment did he realize that he didn't know why he had started to save him, since he was one of the generals who had betrayed him, so he thought it would be better to let go of his hand. Kratos realized there was absolutely no reason to help him, but then he began to remember something. It was from his previous life, and some guy was crying, saying that the professor wouldn't accept his revisions to the essay, so he was afraid he'd remain his slave forever. That's exactly why he asked Jang Chul to talk to this professor, because I thought that only then would the teacher be able to look at his work with a different perspective. He asked because Jang Chul was the best, and all the professors admired him, so I asked him to go talk to the professor. This guy was younger than him, and always followed him around, but in this case, since Jang Chul was a first-class slave, the professor might actually listen to him. However, at that very moment, Jang Chul got scared, thinking that this didn't concern him and he shouldn't do it, because he was afraid he'd never be able to repay such kindness and would only put himself in a worse situation. But now he was acting completely differently and was holding Baal with all his might, not intending to let him go from this cliff. He realized that if he gave it his all and made every effort, then perhaps a smile would appear on that boy's face, even if only in his memory. Kratos managed to pull him even higher, and threw the ogre right to the top of the cliff. Baal was genuinely surprised, for his master had saved him, despite having been wounded himself, even though there was no reason to help. Kratos said something to the effect that this meant absolutely nothing compared to the pain of losing a subordinate. Besides, all his wounds had already healed. After that, Baal just started crying and his body trembled. Credo just hoped that everything would really fall into place when he remembered that boy. He also began watching what was happening in the interface window, while Baal sat nearby. At that moment, he saw the Bale of Happiness token, and they looked familiar. After all, you could use them here to get a discount on ice cream. If the farming idea didn't work out, he might be able to earn even more of them over time. Meanwhile, Baal was still sitting across from him, continuing to look at his master. He thought to himself that, judging by his expression, if he didn't do everything the master said right now, he would simply be destroyed on the spot, and there would be no chance of survival. But suddenly, Kratos, picking up a large shell, said that he had gathered everything they needed, so he was going to throw it, and the others had to catch it. The other demons were greatly surprised to hear that they would have to catch it. But they had no chance to run away or refuse, because in the very next second, it all flew straight at them. Kratos knew that the first step in making fertilizer was to use seagull droppings and Zulu shells, add them to the prepared soil, and then mix it all together. Kratos also told Sergi that she should chop it all up into small pieces, saying that since she had many swords, she would be the one to do it. Although she wasn't thrilled about having to do this, there was no other option, so, taking her weapon in hand, she began to carry out the order. After some time, they returned to their lands, and Kratos asked Sergi if she would be happier if she switched places with Asura. Of course, she wasn't happy about that, so she began hacking away at everything even more vigorously, while Kratos once again thought that all these demons were very impulsive, so there was no time to relax. But in the end, he himself was the Lord of Darkness, so he was determined to get his way by any means necessary. Then Kratos ordered Hartok to create a thick, dense fog, though Hartok asked why he needed it. After quickly explaining everything, Kratos asked if this moisture would be enough. Baal replied that after the fog appeared, it had become as soft as their lord and spoke. Next came the third step. They needed to take the good to a dry place and not let his seagulls near it. This was exactly what he hadn't told the others to do, but he realized that even a small amount would take an incredibly long time. To create enough, they needed to saturate this territory, but there was nothing left to do but draw the attention of all the demons so they would engage in farming. Kratos saw no other option, so shortly thereafter, they set about this task. Meanwhile, the little girl lying on the bed turned to her exhausted father. She lay there with tears in her eyes and begged him to finally eat her. Of course, he began to get nervous that she had brought it up again, since he had ordered her never to say such things again. But the little girl only began to cry even harder, saying that she missed her mother incredibly much. All of this was in her memories, and on that day they were attacked by a giant demon who was very hungry and was about to eat Flutie since she was the first thing he saw. At that very moment, her mother protected the girl by standing in front of the monster's giant mouth. She barely had time to take one last look at her daughter before she found herself in the monster's mouth, becoming its meal. After that, the man simply said that if his daughter were to disappear, he would no longer have a reason to live. At that very moment, he looked back and saw that the Lord had entered their broken-down hut, along with several of his servants. Realizing that this demon still had strength, he ordered them to take him away, but the father began screaming that if his daughter were left alone, the other demons would simply devour her. Flutie scrambled out of bed, trying to reach her father, while Kratos learned that they had already gathered 20 demons, so 30 more were needed. At that very moment, the main character shouted for them to stop devouring their own brothers and sisters and ordered them to gather entirely different demons, saying that from that moment on, they themselves would begin to produce fertilizer. Kratos knew that he was the Lord of Darkness, and to achieve his goal, he would have to justify a similar tyranny, but without sacrifices, success was impossible. After some time, all these demons were already busy at work, though they didn't know why they were wasting their strength on all this. The man knew all the same that sooner or later they wouldn't be able to survive. Even if this land became fertile, there was nothing to eat here right now. But very suddenly, Kratos approached them. He had overheard their conversation, and the man fell silent immediately, though the demon told him to follow him. That day, the purple flower they had accidentally spotted turned out to be the plant that had managed to take root in this place. Kratos said they would grow the roots of these plants and added that Bale and a few others from the team had managed to acquire them from various places. The demon simply apologized, saying that these roots were inedible and that they would experience excruciating pain if they ate them, and it could even be fatal. But Kratos said that they had nothing else to eat anyway, so he wanted to test right then and there whether this plant was edible. After that, he said that this man's daughter should eat it, and of course, her father became incredibly worried about it. But a short while later, when he went to her, he saw that Flutie was sitting calmly, and eating something. Naturally, her father began to worry even more and asked if she was all right. The girl replied that Zephyros and Baal had fed her just yesterday, so she was fine. Credo followed him in, saying that the father had now seen for himself that his daughter's lands could also make such poisonous plants edible, and that it had been a success. Flutie simply said she couldn't believe the Lord was so kind to low-ranking demons like them. He thought to himself that being the Lord of Darkness didn't mean he had to be so gloomy all the time, and added that a rat like her needed to eat a lot and grow big. At that moment, Flutie and the other demons thought that he wanted to fatten her up and then eat her. At night, the temperature was below freezing, and during the day the sun burned so intensely that it was impossible to stay under it. So this climate resembled a hellish highland. Many centuries ago, the people who lived in the Andes suffered from hunger, so they found a way to eat a food they called wild potatoes, even though these potatoes were poisonous when raw. They continued to grow them even now, and when the Lord didn't say to trample all the potatoes that were there, Baal rushed to do it. He began jumping on the potatoes, and they froze the tubers for several nights, then thawed them in the open air, and Baal used his meteorite fall ability on them, thereby removing the poison from the potatoes. By freezing, thawing, and then drying them, they could be stored for a long time and cooked using heat. After some time, the main character ordered the others to gather everyone who had been working with them, for it was time to eat. Even though there wasn't much food, so each person received only 2 potatoes. Zephyros mentioned that there were still a lot of potatoes left that they hadn't processed yet, so they could work on that. But Kratos replied that it still wouldn't be enough for the entire army. He said that the remaining potatoes would be planted, and they would multiply that amount 1,000-fold in time. The demons who received plates of potatoes looked at them in surprise, saying that these were poisonous potatoes and they didn't want to eat them, having heard stories about how no one had survived after eating them. However, Flutie's father said that their lord had found a way to make these potatoes edible, and that his daughter had even eaten them and was now perfectly fine. Despite all this, the man kept saying that their lord was good and that he wanted to feed them, so they began to praise him. Moreover, seeing that this man was the first to eat, the rest of us immediately followed his example, realizing that everything would be all right. Meanwhile, the main character began to hear them shouting his name and praising him, but he thought that he didn't like all this cheering and wanted to change it. Zephyros also noticed that, from the determined look on Kratos' face, it was clear he was confident he could produce as much food as each of them would need. Kratos himself thought that now they needed to divide the farmers into those who would harvest the potatoes and those who would supply the fertilizer. Zephyros said that when they returned home, they should tell the other demons that their lord had invented a way to grow potatoes, and that every demon who harvested wild potatoes would be given food vouchers so they wouldn't go hungry. Kratos noted that his advisor was just as smart as he looked, and while he could be boring at times, he was, on the other hand, the most effective assistant. In the end, the ordinary demons continued to find even more potatoes so they could keep receiving food vouchers. Much later, they removed Asuranta, and Kratos ordered it to be placed in a slightly different spot, overseeing everyone else. Eventually, they found the perfect spot to place it. Kratos thought that after that, it would enrich the soil with nitrogen. Of course, there was plenty of fertilizer, so he thought it was time to move on to the next stage. They needed to distribute the fertilizer evenly across their entire territory, even though it was enormous. The workers' quota was 2 potatoes a day, and they simply wouldn't have the strength for such a huge task, while Asurant, who was hanging back, was already begging to just be destroyed. He wanted to stay here. However, Kratos, of course, didn't listen to him, not realizing that Asurant was a great demon general who didn't even need food since he had been suffering for a long time. In the meantime, he had completely lost his throne, and it turned out that Zephyros had already managed to ask the Lord of the Stars for help. The advisor said he had written an order on behalf of his ruler to redirect the offensive in several directions and recall as many soldiers as possible to assist with farming, but so far there had been no response. Credo thought that they might simply not survive by following this path, but there were too few of them to handle the work of fertilizing the land. Meanwhile, in the Star Zone, the advisor went to his master and began to explain that Kratos had indeed taken up farming and had even produced a certain amount of food. Despite the fact that the more demonic lives they took in this war, the stronger he would become, the master thought that Kratos had deliberately started doing this. Saruthul also didn't ask if his assistant had figured out who was heading to the other Star Lords, and the assistant said he had already done so, and those demons had no idea about Kratos' farming. Saruthul said that most likely they simply wouldn't survive this famine, but then they would become mere food and an army for him. That is why the Lord decided to destroy Kratos and become the ruler of the demons in his place. After some time, Ficamir arrived in Kratos' territory and saw Asuranta, so he thought that Kratos must be very cruel if he had turned this demon into a walking corpse and done such a thing to him. Fikamir simply said there was no need to worry, for Saruthalu had taken a liking to Asuran's aggressiveness and had promised that his lord would accept him once he had destroyed Kratos. Immediately afterward, he began to use his powers to ensure that no one, ever, would be able to grow even a single thing on these lands. One entity appeared behind him and reported that the very fertilizers the scouts had found were here, and Fakamir ordered them to scatter these fertilizers across the entire land. Upon hearing this, the entity began to do so along with the others, mixing the fertilizers with the soil and burying it all deeper and deeper. They kept doing this the whole time until they had spread absolutely all the fertilizer across the land. Credo then said that all of this needed to be mixed into a fine layer with the soil, and since it was very hard work, he worried whether the farmers would be able to handle it. Asuran didn't understand a thing, because he knew that Fikamir had intended to harm Kratos, but what he did only helped. After some time, all these entities had almost finished their work, but they understood that if they didn't see it through to the end, the demon lord would make this land very fertile, so they continued in the same vein. One of them said that number 2718 had never been one to work too hard, so he was surprised that this time he had done so much. But when he saw how much land they had already managed to cultivate, he was overcome with a sense of pride and joy, as if they were doing something incredibly important. In the end, there was very little left, so they kept at it. But after a while, the sun came out and it started to melt, even though they knew they were here for a reason. Fikamir stood nearby with an umbrella and realized the task was done, and now he was really curious to hear what Kratos would say. They still had a lot to do, but the preparations were already very good. Kratos said that until these potatoes sprouted, they couldn't move on, assuming they could even plant them. He began thinking that in a few weeks, at a temperature of 4 degrees, their hibernation would end, and after that, they would need to be moved to a warm place. In the end, he had already ordered Sergi to create that temperature here using cold magic, but now she was as angry as a dog, and Hartok also seemed to be plotting something bad. So he thought that if he angered them, he definitely wouldn't be able to handle both of them, and he worried whether they would attack him. Meanwhile, with the other demons, he wanted to raise the temperature in the barn to 23 degrees, so he made the workers kneel down many times. But in the end, it wasn't very effective, since they had too little strength and were unable to do it. It was then that the Lord decided to return to Asuranta's home, realizing that the ground was fully ready for planting, but not understanding how this had been achieved. Fikamir began to rejoice, thinking that the look on Kratos' face meant they had done everything right and thwarted the Lord's plans. But Baal, meanwhile, grabbed him and said that the skeleton had been hiding nearby, and Kratos knew it was one of the bosses at a certain level, though he was surprised that this demon had come at his request, especially alone. Zephyros asked why they should beat this skeleton without even letting him answer, but Kratos explained that it seemed to be hiding something from him, and beating it would be the best way to get the whole truth. Fikamir merely replied that the Lord was too cruel, but despite that, he wasn't going to tell him a single word about his plan. Realizing this, Kratos immediately began beating him without sparing his strength, and this continued several more times. Now everything became clear, for the fact that they had destroyed the demons working here was the work of Sarathul. It made sense, for the more demons that died, the larger his army would become. But in the end, all of this opened up an opportunity for Kratos, because if he destroyed the Lord of the Stars, those dissatisfied with the successful invasion of human lands would take it as a warning. Kratos thought that they would still try to sabotage his farming, so he needed to solve this problem once and for all to make it effective. Zephyros also added that destroying the Lord would be difficult, since he could become immaterial, like a ghost. Zhang Shul remembered that in the game, the Lord had chased him all over the Star Zone. Even though it was already a very difficult level, to get through it, he had to hide from him as far away as possible the entire time. Credo also thought that they needed to lure this Lord out of his lair in order to defeat him. Meanwhile, Flutie approached Asurant, who was hanging around nearby, and the girl stared at him for a long time. He merely replied rudely that he wasn't happy to see her, and asked why she was looking at him like that. Flutie simply bowed her head, saying that she knew that, thanks to his sacrifice, they would have a harvest, so she just wanted to thank him. Asherin took this as mockery and said that if she dared to speak, he would definitely destroy her. Of course, the demon was incredibly angry and promised himself that once he escaped from here, he would destroy the ruler of Kratos, who had mocked him so much. But very suddenly, he began to see something very strange, for loud music began to echo nearby. It turned out that Kratos had decided to hang a lightning rod, and since Fikamir was there, he was very happy and clever, so they started dancing together. Assurant was surprised to see that this second lightning rod was actually Fikamir, but realizing that this might be his chance to escape, he rejoiced, thinking he wouldn't have to stay here like a grilled chicken under the scorching sun all day long. But it turned out that things weren't as he thought, because Kratos simply wanted there to be 2 lightning rods here. Of course, when Lord Sarathul saw this, he was incredibly angry, realizing what they had done to his advisor. The bird that had become a scout appeared in the game as well, and eventually, holding a small sphere, she watched Kratos very closely. Of course, he was determined to make her regret that her master had tried to destroy everything, and he promised that one day he would. Meanwhile, Flutie was once again near Asura, and he turned to her, asking what she was doing there at all. The girl replied that the Demon King, along with the 4 heavenly rulers, were trying to do some farming or something. Assurant retorted that she was, in any case, just a small, dim-witted child of low birth, whereas Fikamir had managed to do it with the entire field. Despite these words, Flutie didn't take it as an insult. Instead, she walked closer to the skeleton and thanked him for acting as their lightning rod and for helping with the field. At that moment, Fikamir thought she was very cute, and realized that it had all been worth it if he'd made her happy. Assurant, however, could only think that there was nothing good about what they had done with the field. Besides, he didn't see the point in trying to grow anything on this abandoned land, since those damn potatoes hadn't even sprouted, even though they'd been told that if the potato storage wasn't heated, they'd sprout right away. Flutie immediately ran back, as if to report something, and fled as fast as she could. Meanwhile, Kratos was with his advisor, who said there were some doubts about the Lord's plan, since Sarathul had most likely realized it was all a trap and might come after his assistant. But the protagonist said he had everything prepared. He wanted to first send his men to the Lord so that he would jump off his cliffs himself, and then they would have to destroy absolutely all of the occupiers' men. Kratos wanted to ensure that not a single one of them remained, so he was determined to do just that. Meanwhile, Sarathul sat on his throne, watching all this, and thought that Kratos was an idiot, because even if he simply destroyed that camp in this place, the war would not end. That is why he ordered all his devourers to head straight for him and destroy Kratos along with his army. After all, he himself had expected these creatures to come here eventually, and was even waiting for them in this spot. Kratos remembered that when he first encountered these devourer spirits in the game, he racked his brain, not knowing how to deal with them, but eventually began to realize something. This was the second army of this lord's followers, and of course, the problem was that they always attacked in groups. In fact, they turn into incredible monsters that cling to you and quickly make the player incredibly old by stealing years of life. Nevertheless, he still managed to find a way to destroy these creatures. Kratos gathered himself and wanted to use the bloody strike, and he also knew that a lightning attack might work. Kratos' blood. I was already at home and could help with this, and he had previously poured so much blood on the door through which these spirits entered. After that, the protagonist began to cast the spell that Kratos used in his second phase. Accordingly, the protagonist took advantage of this opportunity and realized that he could now use physical attacks against these creatures, so he summoned his army. Many demons immediately came to his aid, and he thought that these farmers might look very miserable, but they were still mobs from the final map, so they couldn't be weak. In the end, he began to feel like a true alpha king with no mercy whatsoever. Moreover, he knew he had a sharp mind, so he reflected on how well he fit into this world. Kratos was about to head back when, to his great surprise, he spotted Flutie stuck among the potatoes. Her father couldn't help the girl at all, since he'd been fighting the other demons the whole time, but seeing that she was in danger, he didn't know what to do. He decided not to leave her there, but noticed that sweet potatoes always end up mixed in with the potatoes. Besides, he just wanted to destroy one of these monsters. Literally a moment later, the girl herself threw a potato at the monster, but Kratos immediately got angry, not understanding why she had done it. And to his surprise, the potato suddenly began to look completely different. After that, they immediately began to run away from there, and it happened instantly. The potato immediately started saying a few words, which of course greatly surprised the main character. But he also realized that this had somehow managed to restart the potato's biological clock, and that was why what had happened had happened. Kratos was incredibly grateful to Flute, so he lifted her into his arms and began praising the girl, saying that she was truly a great hero. After that, the king ordered his farmers to begin an operation to lure Lord Sarathul out of his lair in order to destroy him. But eventually, realizing that this could take a very long time, he said that a much better option would be to storm in on him first. Assurant, meanwhile, continued to hang on that cross, pondering who he really was and what he lived for. He saw the beautiful sun, but just wanted to eat, because despite his condition, he still wanted to keep living. Very unexpectedly, Flutie came over and thanked the demon for telling them about the potato sprouts, since they had managed to harvest a small amount and were given some dried potatoes as a reward. The girl said that the Lord had gathered all the farmers and gone to plant potatoes with them. Of course, Asura thought only of eating because he was incredibly hungry and wanted nothing else. Flutie decided to help him, so they tried with all their might to get those potatoes into his mouth, but she couldn't quite aim it right at his hands, so she ended up just hitting him in the face, which really annoyed the demon. Still, the girl didn't give up and tried again. The next time, she hit him right in the eyes with the potato, but after a while, Azurant was able to eat a little. Credo occasionally glanced at the status window, seeing that this time the rewards for dried potatoes and new farmers were slightly higher. He'd been given 300 points, but he didn't know why he'd received all the others. In the end, he decided not to dwell on it, since he simply understood that these points would be useful in the fight against Lord Sarathul. After some time, having gathered his army, they arrived at the Kingdom of Stars and were already standing before the bridge. The servants who were there saw them, so they immediately grabbed their axes and prepared to tear down the bridge so that Kratos and his entire army wouldn't be able to cross over. Despite this, the demon still tried to jump and did so almost immediately, though of course he didn't make it to the other side. The servants began to laugh loudly, thinking Kratos was an idiot for deciding to do that. After all, he'd just jumped down. But they didn't know his abilities, and only after a while did they see that he was literally stuck in that rock but still alive. Using this glitch, Kratos was able to jump back up, and just as he was next to those souls, they began to panic and rush toward him. Jong Chul, thinking to himself that he was very clever. After all, he had figured out that these spirit devourers would start to fear potatoes, wanted to break in alone and finish them all off with his bare hands. Sarathul met him much later, but he was surprised that Kratos had come here alone and decided to fight this way. All these spirits were very frightened, realizing they didn't like the way Kratos moved, since it allowed him to move much faster than they could. They realized that if they could catch him, they would surely win, but the point was that doing so was incredibly difficult. In just a moment, Kratos had finally emerged from the rock and stood in the middle of the cave, after which all the spirits began to swarm toward him to attack. Although he was a bit exhausted, he realized that he had to keep going no matter what, but at the same time, he thought that now he wouldn't be the Demon King, but a hardcore gamer capable of beating any level. Immediately after that, the other demons, on Zephyros's orders, began hurling potatoes at these spirits with all their might. At first, we were very skeptical about this, but in the end, the Demon King turned out to be right this time. Credo, who had previously said that as long as there was room, his advisor should take command of all the farmers and lead them through this map via the old canal, despite the fact that it was a dead end. Credo knew what he was talking about because he had seen the passage after searching for it for a very long time, and when he was fleeing from this dreadful cliff of the dead, he managed to find this small gap. Back when Jan Chul was just playing, he didn't realize there was absolutely nothing here, and he had stumbled upon what he'd been striving for all that time. But he decided to go further anyway, and noticed that the paths converged here, and the cave led straight to the first battle. However, even then, the boy realized that he could only get there after clearing this ascent. Nevertheless, despite this, it was only then that he was able to obtain the transformation elixir, and he began to think that if he were still there, he would need to save this essence, which was capable of granting all wishes, including changing one's appearance. Flutie's father was incredibly happy to see these potatoes, and was incredibly happy knowing he would return to his daughter with pockets full of food. At that moment, John Cheol remembered his grandmother, who had always cooked for him when he was hungry, but at one point, when he returned from school, he saw an ambulance taking her away in a car. All those memories remained in his mind forever, and now he said he was just trying to feed these people, but this idiot was getting in his way. Very suddenly, Baal approached from behind and said that their enemy was actually very strong, so he wanted to help his master. But Kratos refused him, saying that the ogre should go and carry sacks of potatoes, and that he would deal with Sarathul on his own. Despite this, Sarathul still didn't give up, and was going to use the huge diamond that was the heart of the ice spirit. He had already used this magic before. He wanted to capture more and more spirits with his almighty frost, and begged this heart for even more power to win. But at that very moment, Kratos attacked it, completely derailing all of Sarathul's plans and nearly destroying him. He just lay there, furious that Kratos had somehow managed to find out which city he was in. But now was not the time to talk about. Credo just wanted to destroy the pests once and for all and take what he needed. Sarathul said that the demon was too stupid to have come here alone to defeat a lord as powerful as him. And of course, He wasn't going to give up and said that Kratos simply hadn't seen all his abilities, but it turned out to be the opposite. He'd seen them a full 19 times back when he was playing the game. Even back then, if he continued to pursue this lord, he knew he wouldn't win, since the lord was hiding from one corner of the cliffs to another, which is why a clash with his warriors was simply unavoidable. But then the lord managed to escape into the room where the heart of the ice spirit is located, a terrifying artifact said to have been created at the cost of an ancient dragon's life, meaning that the dead linger in the world of the living through this frost that freezes the soul. Saruthul was simply trying to summon more warriors using this power, but before he could, a paladin appeared, and then the final battle began. The Lord said that Kratos is indeed very strong, but this battle was still meant to be on land. Saruthul transformed into almost an exact copy of Kratos himself, and said that he would be able to defeat him using this copying ability. Moreover, he could copy his stats as well. These stats were the same as those of his character, who had become very powerful by the end of the game, and with a powerful attack and a practically cheat-level dodge, Jang Cheol was able to strike literally at the last moment. But right now, Saruthul is copying Kratos, so he thought it would be easier to win than it was back in the game. Using literally just one skill, he managed to dodge the Lord's attack by simply stepping aside. Kratos also hit him hard, and Saruthul just started screaming that it hurt a lot. On top of that, he finally realized why his opponent was still in perfect shape. Kratos simply replied that farming requires a good head on your shoulders to understand what you're doing. He began attacking with increasing intensity using his strength and was already ready to burn Saruthul once and for all using his own abilities. In the end, he managed to do exactly what he had planned, and in doing so, he managed to boost his own stats. Kratos was truly delighted because he had just needed to find a lot of new gear, so this came in handy. But the battle wasn't over yet. Even though only a fraction of the Saruthul remained, it still wanted to rise again. That's exactly what the Lord did, declaring that this was his source and that this was what a true ancient evil dragon looked like, the very one used to create this heart. Kratos saw that this dragon was gigantic and also had an incredibly powerful health attack, so it was no surprise that this was indeed a powerful final boss. But in the end, he wasn't too worried, since he had summoned absolutely all the inhabitants of the region here, and was ready to attack immediately. After seeing how many demons were supporting Kratos, Saruthul simply suggested they talk calmly before starting the battle. But the dragon was already moving even faster in order to finish him off immediately. We were incredibly angry when we found out that this lord wanted to interfere with their farming, so we continued to mock him as much as we could until we ran out of strength. At that moment, Kratos thought that he could defeat him on his own. But since the Saruthul was still speaking and moving, he didn't really want to destroy it with his own hand. Besides, these demons were still almost powerless, so he figured that as long as they kept beating this dragon, it would remain alive for a long time. In that very second, he decided to summon the Throne of Agriculture, and that is exactly what he did. The very next second, a gigantic throne appeared out of nowhere and began to fall on them, while the dragon continued to lie helplessly on the ground. Once it finally landed, leaving many cracks in the ground, they moved away from there. In just a short while, they had finished all their tasks, while Asura and Fikamir remained here as lightning rod. Realizing what had happened, Fikamir simply said he was leaving this world, since they had already done everything they could. Eventually, the potatoes sprouted, and they now had plenty of food. On top of that, they managed to eliminate all the pests, and destroy those that threatened to ruin the harvest. Kratos was now only curious whether this victory had been added to the 19 he had achieved as a regular player. But right before him, a status window popped up, informing him that as a reward, a secret event had been unlocked for him. Kratos had absolutely no idea what this was, but literally a second later, he saw a small dragon sitting there. The dragon didn't fully understand where he was or what was happening, but upon seeing Kratos in front of him, he thought that Kratos was his father. The dragon had been scared as a hatchling because it was so dark there, but now he had hatched and was finally meeting his father. Despite this, he still didn't know what was going on, and the others around me started shouting that this dragon needed to be eaten, though Kratos simply called them idiots, saying that if the dragon grew up, they'd be able to eat many times more. Only now did I realize that eventually, all these demons really do want to eat him. After a while, everyone returned, and those who had stayed behind were very happy to see Kratos and all their loved ones. Meanwhile, the dragon continued to sit somewhere nearby in a corner, trembling the whole time because he thought they simply wanted to eat him. Meanwhile, the demons simply didn't know what to feed this dragon, since they said dragons eat precious stones, but all he had was rusty iron and nothing else. Zephyros also arrived much later, and said that, as expected, there were problems with the layout of the various plots, just as the Lord had thought. All the seeds they had gathered were supposed to be planted right there between them. But in reality, the ground was too rocky, so no matter how much they dug or how hard we tried, they couldn't get anything done. Credo, with the dragon in his arms, realized that this was more like a mine than just land, and at this rate, they were simply wasting a lot of time clearing the field of rocks. If you don't bring in enough people often, the supply of dried potatoes will run out quickly, and even if other lords send assistance, it won't help at all. Credos eventually started to get really angry, thinking that, like the main character of some manga, he just wanted to summon some kind of beast, like a wombat, to clear away all these rocks. But that was impossible here. Eventually, he realized that whining wouldn't help, and he wanted to come up with a new plan, even though farming had turned out to be difficult. But what made his life even harder was the tornado that literally started bearing down on them all right away. Of course, the main character remembered that. While playing the game, such tornadoes could appear randomly, but he realized it would be very bad if they were swept up in it. That's exactly why the demon shouted at everyone else to run behind the rock and hide quickly, because the consequences could be terrible. Credo himself kept waiting, realizing that the epicenter was still far away, but the wind was incredibly strong, even though in the game, it was just a joke. But as he was running away with the others, he saw Flutie running in the completely opposite direction, as if she had no intention of saving herself at all. She simply saw Asura, who wouldn't be able to escape, so she wanted to save him and help the demon. Credo saw this and quickly handed the dragon to her father so he could hold the beast firmly. He ordered them to keep an eye on the dragon at all costs and added that anyone who followed him would certainly not survive. The others shouted at Kratos that he wouldn't survive there himself, but he realized he absolutely couldn't lose his valuable workers and lightning rod, because farming wasn't just a peaceful gathering of pears and apples to achieve Zen. This farming was a real separate life in which one constantly had to fight. Flutie had already tried to help Asura, but Kratos, who had arrived there, told her to run away quickly, and after that, he tore down the cross on which the demons were tied. Asura started ranting that this rope could bind all 4 generals, so no one would untie it, and ordered them to run away. But Kratos immediately picked them both up and began running away with them to save themselves. The little dragon continued to sit nearby and said that this creature was very strong, unlike his dad. But despite all this, he kept running, trying to save them, and after a while, he threw Asura aside while holding Flutie in his arms. After that, the dragon, despite the man holding him, broke free and said he wanted to help his father because he was a good creature. At the same time, Kratos was covered in blood, realizing that the wind had weakened and the frost had managed to lessen the force of that powerful wind. Along with the dragon, the other 4 generals and demons also tried to help him and carry him out of there. Eventually, he managed to do so, and soon after, Kratos was lying on his bed in his room, resting. Hartok and Sergei, meanwhile, were drawing closer, having come here with specific intentions. The man said that while their king was still unconscious, they should behead him. The girl added that after that, they would deal with those 2 idiots, Baal and Asurant, and then divide the power, since one of them had to become the new ruler of the demon. A short while later, they entered their master's room and prepared to kill him. But as soon as they got closer, they grew a little frightened and froze for a moment. Their bodies began to tremble, for they had already thought that the Lord knew of their arrival and was preparing for his own servants to come here. At that very moment, Asurant and Baal entered and said that Kratos was sleeping and must not be disturbed now, for he was tired. When they saw how he was sleeping, they realized that he was indeed the Lord, for only he could sleep like that. Hartok agreed to leave and said that this time they would retreat, but he was surprised that Asurant had also joined Baal, despite the fact that he had previously been against all these farming practices. The demon merely replied that he didn't entirely support it, but since recently he owed him his life, and he himself didn't like to remain in debt. In the end, Hartok simply said that growing these potatoes had brought a great many problems upon them, and that if the harvest failed, they too would starve to death. But it seemed to him that the others didn't realize this. Assurant replied that in order to avoid starvation, Hartok would have to put his own life at risk. Besides, he didn't know that he himself wouldn't live much longer, but at first he wanted to fight for that life. Even though he knew the chances were slim, Hartok just sighed, saying that they would eventually regret all of this. Just a short while later, while they were talking, Kratos stood up and looked in surprise at Assurant, who was standing nearby. He said that he wasn't on the ruler's side, so there was no point in imagining anything else. But Kratos was only interested in why the living lightning rod was wandering around and talking to everyone as if it were all normal. even though he was supposed to be hanging where he always had been. Despite the fact that the protagonist was very tired, he and his servants once again took Asuranta away to return him to his place. Baal also reported during this time that all the stones were gone. Zephyrus had collected the last remaining one. Finally, he greeted the advisor, but instead of saying, "Good morning," Kratos asked him where he had put all their stones. At that moment, Zephyrus pointed to the dragon flying nearby, gathering every single stone that came into its sight. The dragon was too small to handle the wind blades, but if it ate everything in sight, it would surely grow, which was exactly why it was doing this. Kratos was very happy to see what was happening, and the dragon realized that wind blades don't appear often, and yet wind is needed to form them. But if T-Bon watches the sky and stops the tornadoes in time with his human breath, those tornadoes can be avoided. He thought the fields were almost ready, so it was time to prepare the potatoes. And Zephyrus asked if they needed to make new preparations, since the supplies were almost exhausted. But the Lord said it wasn't worth doing. The farmer's first concern was the weather. The second problem was expenses, and these were the obstacles they would have to overcome in any case. Meanwhile, Sergei sat in her room in front of the mirror and only now touched her helmet. After that, the girl took it off and finally breathed a sigh of relief. Everything they did with the fertilizer smelled awful, and in the end, they spent whole days sitting right there in those fields. But just then, someone knocked on her door. The girl was surprised that Kratos had come here at all, since he'd never done so before, so she immediately asked what he wanted. Kratos said they really needed her help, so he politely asked her to open the door. Sergei simply replied that the two of them shouldn't waste time on all this, to which the demon replied that if they kept talking through the door, the conversation really wouldn't lead anywhere, so he added that he was coming in. This annoyed her, and she said that no one in their right mind would just barge into someone's room like that. However, without saying a word, he simply knelt before her, which, of course, surprised her even more. Kratos immediately replied that without her, they couldn't accomplish anything at all. He also thought that he would kneel as many times as necessary just to save her, and right now, he desperately needed her swords. Sergei began to feel awkward, but said that at the very least, she would listen to what he wanted to tell her. Just then, the demon stood up and said he needed her to cut up all those potatoes for him, since they had to be split in half before planting. Sergei got angry, thinking that he was just playing with her, and that everything he had told her to do was very humiliating. It was actually quite simple. She just had to leave the potatoes with 3 or 4 eyes alone, and if there were more, she had to cut them. Kratos explained that she needed to cut them, so that each half had roughly an equal number of sprouts. He also didn't waste any time, and asked if everything was clear to her, but the girl replied that she hadn't agreed to this proposal yet. But he immediately threw the first potato, followed by several dozen more, so Sergei quickly cut them all up. Kratos, who had just approached and looked at the ground, asked how she had managed to cut them all into such even halves, and praised her. The girl replied that she wouldn't be swayed by all this sweet talk, and called him a lying thief again. But instead, the demon simply took her sword in his hands and, without a word, began to wipe it down. Kratos said that the whole sword was covered in potato juice, so he had to wipe it down. Sergei thought that Kratos had finally lost his mind, because she didn't understand why he was doing this. Besides, she didn't know why this demon had become so sincere and gentle, or what was even going on here. Kratos finally decided that the sword was clean enough, because if you don't wipe off the juice right away, it can damage the potatoes, and it's important to maintain hygiene and cleanliness. So he walked over to her, saying that he needed only her, because only Sergei could cut the potatoes the way he needed them. The girl replied that she would help only this once. She had forgiven him the first time, but now she thought their lord was some kind of idiot. After that, Kratos was delighted and said he would go get some hot water and grab more rags. He also added that none of them would be going to sleep tonight. The potatoes kept getting chopped up, while Hartok stood there watching it all, not understanding what was even going on. He was angry that Sergei had also joined these idiots, and it seemed to him that just a couple of compliments were all it took for her to be ready to fulfill every request. Assurant, meanwhile, continued to hang there, no longer knowing what life meant, and what was the point of life for a lightning rod. For him, it was a life full of suffering. Immediately after that, Flutie pulled him out of his thoughts, telling him that she had a little left and could feed him. The demon was angry with her, saying that as one of the 4 generals, he wasn't going to play with such a pathetic creature as her, and added that as soon as he came down, he would eat her. But then he said she could try, because he was very hungry. However, he was very angry when she couldn't manage to do anything. Hartok, who had come closer, realized that it was all over for Azurant, since they had turned him into a complete laughingstock, and he no longer knew what he was living for. Meanwhile, the Lord's voice was heard, and he ordered the farmers' squads to begin preparing the dried potatoes for planting. Flutie quickly ran back, overjoyed that there would be work again. Hartok thought once more that Ball had always been an idiot, so it was no surprise he was on Kratos' side, and he mused that he was the only sane one here. Sergei was also nearby, so the other demons began thanking her for helping them so much. But the girl told them to shut up, because after all, she hadn't even been trying for their sake. But despite this, she felt a bit pleased, though Hartok was surprised by her expression, since she was a powerful general of the demonic army and was acting this way now. Meanwhile, the other demons began to rejoice because they had received food again, and Hartok wondered how they, as demons, could be so happy about such a thing. He was incredibly angry at everyone, but considered himself the wisest and one of the highest-ranking demons, so he confidently declared that he would be the one to take the throne of the Demon King. Meanwhile, Kratos called everyone to him, saying that they must not be distracted from the planting, for soon the sprouted potatoes would emerge from the ground and everything would get better. He told Ball that as soon as this happened, they would need to get rid of their eyes, and Kratos began to explain why. He explained that at least 3 sprouts appear on a potato. Rarely, there might be 5 or 6. After that, he asked whether it would be better to have more or fewer sprouts on a potato. They immediately started answering that the more, the better, but Kratos replied that this wasn't the case. Hartok once again thought to himself that Kratos was pathetic, since a demon shouldn't need to know this in the first place. Then they began asking why a smaller number would be better, since a larger number always seemed more advantageous. Hartok finally couldn't take it anymore and said that these idiots would understand if they just started thinking a little, because every sprout needs a certain amount of nutrients, just like the roots they eat. And if there are too many sprouts, the potato won't be able to properly nourish the roots. Kratos himself was actually quite surprised, since he didn't know how the demon knew this. After all, no one here could possibly have been taught agriculture. Hartok replied that there was no need to learn something so primitive, since it was obvious and should be clear to absolutely everyone. Kratos was surprised by what he heard, and then Sam decided to ask how many sprouts would be best for them in that case. He replied that they needed no more than 2, because one might think that 1 would be enough in terms of nutrient distribution, but if it broke, the roots would stop nourishing the plant. In that case, after cutting these sprouts, there is another step, and Hartok replied that it is soil preparation, so it is necessary to add compost and dig up the soil, saturating it with oxygen. But such soil might appeal not only to potatoes, but also to various weeds which also want to get nutrients. We might have to get rid of them, and he added that they could have figured this out on their own if they'd just used their brains once in a while. Kratos shouted that Hartok was a genius and ordered everyone to applaud someone like him. The man himself recalled how his mother had always called him dim-witted and rather stupid. So he was very surprised that now Kratos and all the other demons were starting to call him the wisest demon, and the Lord also asked him to become the head of the Farmers' Brigade from that moment on as the new leader. Hartok almost laughed and thought that he was a demon, and his mind was needed to destroy and steal things, not to be the head of the farmers. Credo, meanwhile, asked no further questions and said that the others must show their loyalty to their new leader. They all began shouting that he was a higher-ranking demon, and that he was indeed very intelligent and knew a great deal. But this actually began to annoy Hartok. He simply ordered them to follow him, and decided that he would help them at least a little for now. Meanwhile, the protagonist opened the status window and discovered that he had worked through Ball's lonely childhood, and made him his loyal assistant, though Kratos didn't know how. It also stated that he had given Azurant a friend he had never had before, and his cruelty stats had also been eliminated. Moreover, he managed to win the heart of Sergei, who had never once experienced the taste of love and warmth. And to Hartok, Kratos granted what he desired most, namely his recognition. And in the end, it became clear that each of those demons had deep and profound wounds in their hearts. After that, the protagonist noticed he had acquired a new skill called Blood Vision. Even though it didn't exist in the game, it stated that he could see the immediate future of a selected target for the next 6 hours. Kratos was delighted by this, and a location was marked on the map between the abandoned lands of the demons and the territories of humans. After some time, a man walked inside and said he was finally healthy. Azrahan was grateful to Daul for all he had been forced to go through for his sake, and also said that in his next life, he would like to be born with a more resilient body. Joel replied that he would like to become an aristocrat in his next life, one who possessed great wealth and ruled over all around him. After that, Azrahan said they were planning to return to the kingdom and asked if old Kimchi wanted to go with. But the boy replied that he didn't know, since he had said earlier that he wasn't sure who he had been before, though it didn't seem like he was from the land of humans. After all, when he entered their lands, it was immediately clear from the locals' eyes that he wasn't welcome here. Old Kimchi also thought that someone like him certainly couldn't be welcome. Azrahan replied only that he could change his clothes, since the style of all the inhabitants of these territories was completely different. But in the end, the boy simply didn't take off his cloak, and the other two thought that he was just too attached to it. Old Kimchi replied that he himself would have liked to take off those clothes, but simply couldn't, because they were like a second skin to him. A little later, they met another man and said goodbye to him, telling him they would share his story with the king when they returned. It turned out that the aristocrat, acting on the king's orders, was exploring the nearby lands of the demons, and he too lacked unnecessary pride. Azrahan was a kind and good man, but in this case, he simply didn't know who he really was. He didn't even know what his mission was now, but recalling his past life, he realized that he was destroying himself with every new task. At that moment, it seemed to him that someone like him was capable of nothing but cruelty. Meanwhile, the other demons working in the garden beds were incredibly happy and almost began to celebrate when they saw the first sprouts. Besides, there were an incredible number of them there, and Flutie came to tell Asurant about it, saying that the sprouts had finally appeared, though he didn't know what he was doing there himself. Meanwhile, their lord ordered his flock to move on to the next stage. Hartok was now supposed to be the one to explain this stage, and the man began to say that they now needed to carefully cover the sprout stem with soil. This would allow the potato to break through into the sunlight. Otherwise, the root of the tuber would change, and the taste would become significantly worse. At the same time, Kratos decided to check the weather using his skill. He had previously invested 200 points into the ability to check the weather forecast, and his bloody vision had also improved. However, the activation condition now was not to blink for 200 seconds, which seemed difficult. Of course, he tried to do it, but tears began to stream from his eyes. However, the other demons thought that the Lord was crying because the first sprouts had appeared. In reality, he was very happy because there shouldn't be any blades today, so he allowed T-Bone to rest while he had the chance. But then an advisor unexpectedly came to him and reported that a subordinate of the second Star Master had arrived. Immediately after that, they met at the castle, and it turned out that his name was Laploa, and he was the advisor to the second Star Master, Planus. Immediately after receiving the order to cease fire and send aid for agriculture, the third master, Raster, immediately began attacking them. He said that Kratos had become very weak and therefore wanted to take his place. Kratos himself did not understand at all why all these beings thought the same way. After all, if the third Star Master were to make the second one his subordinate, it would be difficult to deal with him. And in the end, that was the right decision, because despite their low rank, there would have been many of them there. That is precisely why Kratos decided that before the second Star Master could rise from her ranks, he must defeat Ratzer. However, he realized he could not leave the battlefield. The territory belonging to the second Star Master is located at the distant foot of the Dead Man's Cliff and is called the Swamps of Decay. If you compare it to the game map, the swamps are 10 times larger and, moreover, are very far from them. Kratos just remembered the abandoned well that controls the reinforcements and all the universes. He thought that if he used this well, he would be able to quickly reach the swamps, but it turned out that the well located beneath the demonic castle wasn't working. In the end, he thought that as the final boss, he simply couldn't fight with his own hand. Sergi, meanwhile, said she had absolutely no desire to fight for the ruler. Baal, on the other hand, said he would do absolutely everything his master commanded right now. 2 of the 4 generals were to lead the warriors, and several strong but useless demons, who were of no help on the battlefield, were to be sent with them. As soon as they entered the final boss's zone, all paths to Hartok would open, and Kratos himself was to focus his attention on growing even more potatoes. Planus said at that moment that Raster simply couldn't disobey their ruler's orders, since that would violate all their rules. But that was exactly what Raster wanted, saying that he shouldn't be misunderstood, since he simply had no choice. After all, if they simply laid down their arms, it would lead to their race being wiped out forever. Planus then said that the Lord had thought about this very thing and had written about agriculture and how it could be used to feed everyone without attacking humans. However, Raster could no longer be stopped, and he said that the problem was precisely that fighting was the pride of their demonic race, and it was also their history. Shortly thereafter, Baal and Sergi arrived, leading the entire demon army. The girl agreed with Raster and his words, but said that this had never been the norm, for when their entire lives had turned into a battlefield, it was not a good thing. Meanwhile, Flutie was trying her hardest to find her father, and started saying that they needed to rush to the battlefield as soon as possible. Sergi, on the other hand, said that they needed to preserve life, not destroy it, and that this was what they should be proud of now. After a while, Flutie ran up to Kratos, saying that it was very beautiful there, and that she had never seen anything like it in her life. Meanwhile, Sergi and Baal continued their fight against Planus, determined to destroy him once and for all. Kratos said that an incredible number of these flowers had bloomed, far more than he had initially expected. When Planus heard that destroying life was no cause for pride, he began to laugh, for the idea that one should pity and value people was a joke to him. He said that to survive, one must destroy, and Baal, who began to grow angrier, said he didn't understand what this was all about. At that very moment, Kratos ordered that absolutely all of these flowers, which would be of no use to anyone, be cut down. While the others began to think that their king was already far too cruel, Hartok was pleased to see this scene, thinking that their king was indeed cruel enough to be the king of demons. At that very moment, he approached the others, telling them to indeed cut down absolutely all of these flowers, just as their master had said. However, despite the fact that this was their order, they simply could not carry it out, saying that they had grown these flowers and that for the first time on their lands, something so beautiful had bloomed. Hartok said that if they left everything as it was, nothing good would remain from the nutrients and sunlight, since all of that would be used only for the flowers, and the king's grand plan was for all the energy to be focused on growing potatoes. Kratos was incredibly pleased to see how many potatoes they would eventually have, but others thought he was so happy because these flowers were being destroyed. After some time, Planus came to his palace, and the king asked why he had raised a rebellion, since even the First Lord had been unable to do so. He replied that Planus could simply be destroyed, for he was the demon who had lost his honor in battle and was no longer worthy of life. But when Kratos actually tried to do so, it turned out that all of this was merely armor, so such attacks on Planus had no effect at all. However, upon hearing this, Kratos devised a new plan. He said they needed to untie the first thunder of the guard, since he'd been struggling to block blows lately, so it was time for him to retire. Eventually, after some time, Asuranta was untied and fell to the ground. Flute approached him anxiously. Despite being exhausted, he looked at Flute, remembering that she was the one who sometimes teased him, and said that he would eat her first, and then Kratos as well. He was already ready to do it, but simply collapsed immediately after trying to take a single step. Baal stepped closer, saying that he had simply regressed into a small child, but Asuranta was, of course, enraged by those words. Realizing that he wouldn't be able to walk on his own, Baal picked him up, even though he began to protest. Despite all this, he hoisted him onto his back and said that this was an order from the Demon King, so he would sit there just like that. Asuranta felt a bit awkward, but he had no other choice at the moment. Kratos, meanwhile, had calmed down a bit, as he'd feared Asuranta would wreak havoc once freed. But before doing so, he used his bloody vision skill and decided to release the demon, knowing he simply wouldn't be able to move for a while yet. Sergi, meanwhile, continued to cut flowers, and she was the one doing it in the blink of an eye. After all, they didn't have that many dried potatoes left now, and with that, the farmer's wages were gradually decreasing. Even if the demons ate less and got used to hunger, he could clearly see how exhausted they were. After a while, Planus arrived right at these fields. He said he had come personally to thank Kratos for saving them, but the demon was very angry to see that he had come to thank him with absolutely empty hands. But then Planus began to speak, saying that he and the Third Lord had gathered their subordinates and would send them here to work. However, Kratos didn't know what to say to that, since they certainly wouldn't have anything to eat. He had even started to worry whether the potato idea was really a good one, so he decided to dry the potatoes they had now and build up at least some reserves. He just wanted to see his workers completely satisfied. Besides, the main character didn't know why he had decided to get into farming in the first place. At the same time, Planus said that in that case, he would reorganize the entire army as soon as possible. Immediately after that, he went off to Kratos, recalling that in the game, Plank was a low-level boss without any special skills who demonstrated incredible loyalty to Kratos, declaring that strength lies in truth. Conversely, Planus was now thinking that this soil contained a great deal of nutrients, something he had never encountered in the swamps. Ever since the days when he was just a sapling, he had seen nothing edible in their lands and had suffered constantly. He simply wanted to become the king of demons, regardless of absolutely anything. Meanwhile, the main character, along with the other demons, continued their demonic exercises. For a while, they carried out all his orders until Baal arrived and told them they had incredibly big problems. The ogre began explaining that all the potato tops had turned yellow for some reason, and he didn't know what to do now. They started thinking that they hadn't tried hard enough, but in reality, even Hartok didn't know what to do in such a situation, and wondered if there had been enough wind, water, and things like that. Credo also came over to see what had happened, and noticed how dull the color was, but in reality, the potatoes themselves were huge. There were twice as many as in the first batch. It turned out that they were growing by drawing all the nutrients from the leaves and becoming even bigger. So there was no reason for them to worry, but the main character, still lying in bed, kept reminiscing about his past life. He remembered very well the tomatoes he had managed to grow with his grandmother. The woman was very happy when she saw that her grandson had managed to grow them on his own, and praised him. But the moment when they took her away in the ambulance stuck with the boy, and he couldn't sleep peacefully because of it. On the day it happened, he was extremely anxious and didn't even know what to do next. Kratos thought that no one needed all these memories, since, given his personality type, he shouldn't give in to such sentimentality. Soon enough, he'd be able to eat as many potatoes as he wanted, but it was too early to relax. After all, eating just one potato wasn't an option either. If there were to be an epidemic, none of them would survive here, just like during the Great Famine in Ireland. He was simply dealing with the immediate potato crisis, but he needed to sort out the seeds of other crops as soon as possible. At that very moment, he began to sense that something was happening. The entire building started to shake, and the protagonist jumped up in fright. After a while, a giant tree appeared here, and he began to realize that something was wrong. Meanwhile, Flutie continued to stand among the potato rows. She was so worried that all the leaves had turned yellow. The girl tried to find at least something, but when she saw that they were all yellow, she became very worried, not knowing what was happening, and started running to tell the adults everything. But before she could find anyone, she saw a giant tree destroying everything in its path. Planus kept holding their master, and began to say that he wasn't a beetle, but a real demon king. To him, the entire potato field was filled with nutrients, and it had been created by Kratos himself, so Planus simply said that thanks to this, he had grown up this way. 624. Of course, the demon grew increasingly nervous, and when Planus noticed this, he was even more delighted, saying that the king simply couldn't do anything to him. In reality, the protagonist wanted to harm him, but Planus was destroying him much faster. Seeing everything that was happening, Baal decided that he would protect the demon king, since he didn't want to leave him alone, and Sergei also said that they couldn't let him leave them. Baal said that the demon king was weak, and he realized this when he managed to lift Kratos. Meanwhile, Planus threw the king into the abyss and began to advance on the demons, telling them to listen to him carefully, and also informing them that Kratos was now gone. He also began to say that it was worth recalling the old laws of the demons, since their power directly depended on strength. That is why Planus said that since he was now the strongest here, he would become their king. Hartok now realized that Planus had managed to extract all the useful resources from the earth, and after Kratos was gone, he himself had become the strongest. And in the end, just as their law dictates, they must follow the strongest. All of them, except Zephyros, knelt down, saying they would worship the new ruler of these lands, for he had become the strongest. Asura didn't understand why Zephyros wasn't on his knees yet, saying he needed to show respect. Eventually, the boy did kneel before him, but for him, it was humiliating and unforgivable. He was loyal to only one ruler, and as he knelt, tears streamed down his face. Meanwhile, Kratos began to recall how he used to play with his mother. She had suggested playing hide and seek, and the boy had happily agreed. His mother told him to close his eyes and then look for her after she counted to 10. Eventually, the little boy did just that, but after he started looking for his mother, he realized he couldn't find her anywhere and became anxious. Kratos could now hear those cries and understood that it hurt him just as much as it had back then. However, just at that moment, the system alerted him that he needed to come to his senses, and finally, Kratos was surprised to see his name in the window. He also thought that the quantum leap had glitched, but eventually realized that he simply couldn't move, because there wasn't even any room to do so. All he could do was wiggle his hand, and he wanted to at least move it a little, so, despite the difficulty, he began counting and trying to reach it. Planus, meanwhile, spoke again, telling the advisor to come closer to him. Zephyros, with Tybon behind him, stepped forward, saying that he welcomed the new lord of the demon. The new king said that this important first step needed to be recorded in detail, and declared that the demons would intervene and not attack humans. He wanted power over them, and said they would raise humans and then eat them. At that moment, Hartok realized this was the starting point, and began to think that perhaps it wasn't so bad after all, since they would destroy and wage war for as long as they needed to. But despite the fact that they had lived this way before, Hartok's treatment of all the other generals now irritated him immensely. Meanwhile, Kratos was still trying to get out, but so far to no avail, and he was even starting to choke. Then the advisor said that it would be difficult for them to go into battle anyway. Zephyros reported that he only had a few potatoes left to eat, and that was too little for a military campaign. But Planus grabbed the little girl, saying they had plenty of food and there was no need to worry about it. Assurant, seeing this, couldn't just stand by, for he was outraged by such behavior. Planus replied, "Well, that's your problem," adding that these weaklings were so worthless they could only be used for food. Flutie shouted that they weren't like that anymore, and didn't eat each other to survive. That was precisely why she had started growing potatoes. The girl explained that it was all thanks to Kratos, who managed to grow potatoes here, and that everything changed after that. Meanwhile, Kratos himself lay deep underground, still unable to move. Now he just kept thinking of them all, wondering where they would start starving if he wasn't there, so he couldn't stay here. With his last ounce of strength, he used a blood strike and directed it straight at himself so he could break free. Kratos realized he couldn't let any of them starve, so despite all the pain, he kept crawling forward to escape. Meanwhile, Asura managed to rescue Flutie from Planus' grasp, as he had no intention of handing her over to that creature. Meanwhile, Kratos tried to crawl at least somewhere, but there was very little space, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to move forward. He didn't know how long he'd been lost, or whether he was even heading in the right direction, or just making things worse. But he hoped that at least something would work out. Flutie was already in Asuranta's arms, but she was very surprised that he had helped her escape. Planus, of course, was furious at what he had just seen, and thought that this demon had simply lost his mind by doing such a thing. Realizing he needed to justify himself somehow, Asurant simply said that Flutie was his emergency reserve, and that he had had his eye on her for a long time, so he decided to save her in order to eat her before she went bad. A blow followed, and he knocked Flutie out of Asurant's hands, after which the two of them fell. Zephyros was enraged by what he saw, but Planus told them to prepare for war one last time. To this, Zephyros simply said that they had no reason to start this war. Baal also intervened and began attacking him, refusing to give up or obey Planus' orders. He grabbed Zephyros and said that their lord had already given his advisor a task. If Zephyros didn't survive, no one knew who would count the entire harvest. Hartok, however, said that the former ruler's approach to agriculture was the most sensible and should continue to be followed. Sergei also said she had something to say, since their former ruler had found a way to avoid such unnecessary loss of life. Therefore, they saw no point in starting a war with humans, since they had previously attacked them only because they needed to eat something. But now they had found an alternative. Hartok began to say that to become a lord, one must earn authority, and Planus certainly hadn't earned it. Despite being told that Kratos was no longer alive, they continued to consider him their lord and wanted to punish Planus for still being in their potato fields. Sergei, along with Baal, kept attacking him, cutting through all the branches so his body couldn't move. Planus, of course, was incredibly angry because he couldn't understand how they dared to use their power against the new ruler. It was a lack of respect. He struck Hartok very quickly and pinned him to the ground. Sergei was also lying unconscious, her helmet having flown off her head. Only Zephyrus, who managed to escape, grabbed Flutie in his arms and began to run away to save at least her. But very suddenly, Kratos' voice rang out. He grabbed Planus' giant branch with all his might and held it long enough to give them a chance to escape, and then simply tore it apart. They were surprised to see him, as they hadn't thought he was alive. But the protagonist himself had activated the concentrated nutrients mode. He thought of his grandmother again, and what had happened just 10 minutes ago when he'd tried to crawl out of there, thinking it was too difficult. His grandmother heard him say that all of this was too difficult for him, and the boy cowered in a corner. But his grandmother calmly continued with her tasks, saying that every living creature is a seed, and even in hard times, they must find a way from the depths of the earth to rise into the air and sprout. And once they appear, other seeds will follow, and then the young sprouts will fill more and more space. Eventually, if we wait a little and have faith, all the trees will turn green. But then the boy asked why, in that case, his father hadn't survived due to overwork, and his mother had abandoned him, so he began to compare himself to a rotten seed. He said he would live just like his mother, and do everything solely for himself, to achieve success, and live exclusively for his own pleasure. But when, much later, his grandmother was taken to the hospital in critical condition, he couldn't hold back his emotions. Even though it was very difficult for the main character, he began using the bloody strike to push himself even further. After a while, a status window popped up, and he noticed that there were stat points, even though he remembered that the game definitely didn't have that. Right then, he used them and saw that all his stats could increase by 30%, which is why he now had a chance to get out of there. Using his skill, he boosted absolutely all his stats to be able to move faster. And in the end, this tactic worked, because after a while he crawled out from under the ground, sticking his hand out into the fresh air. Of course, Planus, who saw Kratos alive, was very surprised, because he couldn't understand how anyone could survive in such a place. Kratos simply told him to stop staring, since he was standing right there in front of him, so it was obvious he had managed to survive. All the other demons, seeing that their lord was still alive, began joyfully shouting his name, declaring that he was truly the best and praising his harvest. Sergei Nikolai opened her eyes, exhausted, and realized that right now, Planus was too strong to be defeated. Planus said that right now, he would destroy all of Kratos' subordinates. But the demon just smiled, saying that Planus wouldn't be able to lay a finger on his servants right now. He understood that it didn't matter how much Planus had managed to ramp up his power, because after all, this was still a game, and he was bound by the rules of this game. Therefore, Kratos knew that if he treated these attacks the same way he would in the game, he could easily dodge them. Besides, the group of farmers had become significantly more effective after their daily training, since the exercises there were truly intense. That's exactly why Kratos addressed each of them again, then ordered them to start warming up right alongside him. The demons, following his command, immediately began doing what Kratos said and listened to his every word. Planus was shocked by what he saw, because despite all his efforts and diligence, he couldn't manage to affect the demons even a little. After this, the monster would have no strength left, since it would take hours to recover, which was exactly what Kratos was aiming for. Now Planus looked very angry, and up until this point, they had only used game mechanics that Kratos was familiar with, but now Kratos wanted to use the logic of the real world. He released the dragon from his hands and told it to fly higher and higher. Immediately after that, T-Bon used his skills and employed his ice breath to freeze Planus. Kratos was delighted, but realized that even with his insane power boosts, he simply wouldn't be able to harm this massive. But after all, Planus was just a giant plant, and if they froze it to low enough temperatures, they would be able to defeat it anyway. In that case, it would simply start to expand, and its bark would eventually crack, allowing them to defeat the monster. Before long, the dragon had returned, and Kratos immediately praised the boy, saying he had done a tremendous job. They also knew full well that the weakness of any tree lies precisely in its bark, and so, after a short while, it began to crack. Even more cracks appeared after they attacked the monster. Tybon and Flutie stood next to Zephyros, who was protecting them, and eventually the protagonist deactivated the nutrient concentration skill right then and there. Seeing that Planus' face had vanished, I immediately thought that they had managed to defeat this monster. Kratos, who had fallen nearby, looked at this and thought it was strange, because in the game, after destroying this monster, the body would disappear, so he didn't know why this plant was still here. But the protagonist didn't even have the strength left to move a finger. On top of that, it turned out that Planus was still alive, and had managed to regenerate into a new monster by creating a new body for himself. He said that he had absorbed absolutely all the nutrients that were here, and as soon as he realized his life was about to end, he directed all his resources toward creating a new body. Planus said that he had been nothing but a wretch when he ended up in these swamps, and grew into a rotten sprout. But now that he had gained the power of a lord, he wanted to make the whole world drown in this poison and approach Kratos, intending to finish him off once and for all. But at that very moment, Baal decided to help fight, for he had no intention of letting his master leave this world. Despite being strong enough, Planus easily knocked the ogre away from him, along with his weapon. Sergei, who had also tried to attack, was unable to do so, even though they had been watching and gathering strength for quite some time. After she attacked, he began to fight, and Hartok struck the monster, but nothing good came of it. Asura didn't stand idly by either, so he began cutting through all the branches belonging to Planus, and told him to pray for such a wonderful harvest. Immediately after that, he managed to sever the head of this giant tree from its body. After that, Planus' body began to decompose, just as it had in the game that Zhang Cheol had played so much. They stood there on this territory, watching as a strange rain of small spheres of light fell upon them. They all stood up, and Zephyrus decided to record what was happening here, for now he was documenting the victory of the Lord of Darkness's army. Immediately after that, every demon present began shouting his name and praising him, declaring that their lord was the best. But despite all this joy, Kratos immediately ordered them to be silent and say nothing more. After that, The protagonist sank to his knees on the field, realizing that everything was lost and that now he would have to start all over again. He simply couldn't forgive himself for letting his subordinates go hungry, but he realized he had no right to make them start from scratch again after everything they had already been through. Kratos knew he couldn't force them to suffer after everything the demons had already done for him. But suddenly, the very rain that had been falling reached the ground and touched the leaves lying crumpled nearby. After all, the demons who had been in prison had recently spoken with the head steward and mentioned that the Lord had changed in recent years. However, now there was absolutely no difference, since they were still just ordinary food that no one cared about. Little Zephyrus continued to sit behind the bars while one of the higher-ranking demons entered, and all the others who were sitting further away stepped back out of fear. This demon quickly grabbed the little boy by his shirt and tried to pull him toward himself, again seeing him as nothing more than food. But much to his surprise, Kratos appeared then, stopping the demon before he could do anything, and then threw him aside. He looked at Zephyros, asking why the boy hadn't begged for his life, since it seemed he didn't care at all whether he lived or not. But Zephyros simply replied that, for him, it would actually be a relief, since living in such conditions seemed simply unbearable to him. The boy, at that moment, Kratos smiled, saying that he was very different from all the other demons sitting there. So, he offered to go with him, adding that he could appoint him as the new chronicler of the demonic race. Zephyros hesitated for a while longer, but the king said it would be a waste of resources if someone like Zephyros were simply sent to the slaughter. He said that someday, as the Lord of Darkness, he would definitely solve this problem. Then he stepped forward to begin doing once again what they had done before. When Hartok saw that Zephyros had begun working, he ordered the other demons to immediately start leveling the ground to create new garden beds. Everyone eagerly rushed to help, since they wanted to help on their own. Seeing this, Kratos ordered the first group to find at least one area with living crops, while the second and third groups were to do what Hartok had said. Sergei was to cut up all the remaining potatoes, while Zephyrus was to sharpen the blade. Hartok, along with the first group and Asurant, had to find and bring the tools he was about to name so that there would be a bountiful harvest again. That's why I got to work, and Kratos admitted that he had almost forgotten what real farming was like, because there will always be natural disasters, pests, climate change, or price fluctuations, and you have to fight all possible enemies and endure failures in order to start fighting all over again. They had to fight for their survival in Flute, and at that moment, she saw that one sprout was still alive. The girl quickly ran over and saw that at least one had managed to survive, so she grabbed it and began to pull. But it was difficult for her to do so, and despite all the strength she was putting into it, she couldn't manage it. Only after a while did another hand reach out to grasp hers to help. It was Assurant, and he told the girl to hold on tighter. On the count of 3, they would pull together. After a while, they finally managed to pull out this potato, but it was so large that it was many times bigger than a normal one. Flutie was very happy to see this, so she quickly ran to the king to show him the enormous potato they had grown. Kratos was very shocked by what he saw and asked where on earth she had found it, to which the girl replied that she had simply pulled on a sprout and a whole pile had appeared from the ground. After all, something similar had happened in the game after defeating Planus, but he hadn't even expected such a result. It turned out that after he was gone, small green patches appeared on the ground, and his nutrients simply returned to the earth. That's exactly why Kratos told everyone else to drop what they were doing and just dig as deep as possible. So, the demons got to work and started pulling up more and more of this giant potato. And of course, that made them very happy. Kratos thought that this was a wonderful harvest, and was very happy himself, because now they had something to eat. Finally, he was able to assess the situation that had now arisen. He wanted to start with the territory of the first Star Master, in order to gradually move further and further. Saruthul rebelled against him, but he had already been destroyed, and after the destruction of the heart of the forest, all his assistants vanished, and now there is no one there. Next comes the land of the second Star Master, whom they also overcame. After all, once Planus was no longer alive, all his subordinates were in such a state of shock that they could do nothing. Lord Raster now serves as a lightning rod, so the protagonist is pondering whether to punish him even further. Finally, there remains the fourth Star Master, who belonged to the reptilian race. His name was Tartu, and he was portrayed quite accurately in the game. The remaining demons from the second zone and the lizards from the fourth will be easy to destroy, but we shouldn't have summoned everyone here. Even though they gain extra strength, there will be more hungry mouths to feed. Later, Zephyros arrived and reported that, as ordered, they had begun cutting the shoots, and Kratos said that the Brotherhood had ensured that absolutely everyone had received their food. Also, a small demon who looked like a leather-clad figure said that all orders had been sent out to the regions, and Kratos asked if they had obeyed these orders. Demi replied that the fourth Star Master had refused, though he didn't understand why. The small one replied that they hadn't told him anything at all, though he hadn't thought to ask. Kratos was very annoyed by this attitude, and didn't understand why they were all so stupid. He just wanted to know why the fourth Star Master had refused to obey him. Only then did the little demon say that this master had very few servants left and simply had nothing. Kratos asked if he had questioned the other servants, and he replied that he hadn't. The protagonist grew even angrier, thinking he was supposedly talking to an idiot as thick as a cork. At that moment, Zephyros said that maybe Kratos was acting that way, but he was still their Lord of Darkness, so he continued to record absolutely everything. After that, the advisor also said he would try to talk to this demon and asked what the servants had said about where their master had gone. Only then did the demon begin to respond, saying that they had decided to start attacking people and adding that they would use their bodies as fertilizer. According to the game's plot, around the same time, an ancient paladin awoke, and he would destroy any demon that crossed his path. And the longer they left the people alone, the longer the paladin wouldn't touch them. Plus, not much time had passed, so the old Kimchi hadn't appeared yet, and the protagonist thought his theory was indeed correct. But in reality, he was incredibly worried that the old Kimchi would come for their souls and would definitely want to destroy them all. Fearing such an outcome, Kratos said he was going to stop this overgrown lizard right now to prevent things from getting even worse. He also believed it would be much easier for him to handle this alone than to wait for everyone else, so he decided to use mana seas to boost his stats. He exploited every single glitch and exploit to maximize his efficiency. And soon after, he arrived at the abandoned demon lands stretching far from the Tower of Life and the Paladin's tomb. There was absolutely no one there, but in the game, old Kimchi encountered Elbia's squad right at that spot. And there was also a settlement of exiles where they could stop for a short while. Much later, old Kimchi and his companions reached the border between the lands of demons and humans, and they approached the fortress of Magrat. The people working there saw Azrahan and his assistant and were delighted, but they didn't know where all the other soldiers were. Moreover, they were wary of the fact that there was one unknown person with them. When they came closer, the guard thanked him for making such a difficult journey and for the aristocrat going to such great lengths to help them. He also asked what had happened to the warriors who had set out with him, since Volkos, as their commander, should have known what had befallen them. Asrahan replied that monsters had attacked them along the way, and they hadn't even been able to get close to the border, which was why things had turned out this way. Finally, after that, he said they could enter and let the two men through. But when it was old Kimchi's turn, he stopped him, saying that everyone except him could pass. Azrahan began to explain that they had met this stranger at the very place where he himself had been wounded, but Volkos replied that only those who had passed through the city gates could enter them again. Joel stepped closer, saying that of course they weren't asking him to simply turn a blind eye to this violation, so he offered him a bribe. Volkos became extremely angry when he saw what he was doing, and said that both Diol's children and his children's children would be just as monstrous as he was. After that, the commander ordered old Kimchi's cloak to be removed, because if there was anything suspicious underneath, he would end up without a head. Azrahan didn't want him to take off the cloak, because old Kimchi looked very suspicious to their world in that outfit. Eventually, they simply began to be attacked, and others reported this as well. It turned out that it was already too late, and Yashur had come here with his army to attack. Old Kratos, meanwhile, kept moving forward, trying to catch up, and could only hope that everything would work out for him. But now, despite old Kim, he thought that all of this was due to memories from his past lives of what had happened before in his destiny, and that was precisely what had driven him to go into battle again. If the Duke hadn't restrained him back then, he might have thrown himself into that chaos again, as if that were his destiny. He didn't even understand his own behavior, or his true desire, but everyone was afraid, and perhaps it was precisely in moments like these that he was bound to fight. It was at that very moment that Yashur ordered all the people to be killed and their bodies taken away to be turned into fertilizer. They were going to live here for only a short time anyway, so Commander Volkos said it would be better to at least prevent these idiots from reaching their homeland. They knew Joel just thought he was a complete idiot, and mused that if he were an aristocrat in his next life, he'd never let Azrahan out of his sight. Meanwhile, the demons had already made their way inside by breaking through the last wall and were as close to the people as possible. A short while later, one of them grabbed a little girl, who immediately began to cry because she had been taken away from her mother. But soon, meanwhile, but old Kimchi replied that if the lizard didn't leave, he would single-handedly wipe out every last member of its kind right then and there. It seemed just then, Kratos suddenly arrived and struck the lizard hard on the head, starting to shout. The king, standing where he was, he continued to hit the lizard on the head, saying that he was a complete idiot for attacking people and wouldn't even listen to any explanations. So he kept hitting him. Kratos said that they were already managing just fine with growing their own food, so there was no point in attacking people. Meanwhile, at that moment, Kratos truly began to fear and thought that it was time to buy himself a spot in the cemetery after hearing those words. He visibly got nervous and said that some computer operating system had glitched and he didn't understand anything. The old Kratos realized at that moment that if he kept making excuses like that, he would definitely be destroyed right there on the spot, and he began to think that the best thing he could do was to use absolutely everything in his arsenal. He ran very quickly straight at the boy, who had already prepared to defend himself and attack, but suddenly Kratos simply fell to his knees and bowed his horns to the ground for the first time. The old man didn't understand what was going on at all, but Kratos explained that this was called a deep bow, and it was precisely a gesture of apology or gratitude. So, the Demon King himself had no intention of interfering in human territory, unlike that beast. But the demon kept begging him to believe them, and added that until these horns were worn down to the bone, he would apologize 10 times, or even 100, or as many times as it took. Kratos, at that very moment, a vision flashed before his eyes of the same boy bowing to his client. That man was very cruel and mocked him, saying that he worked terribly and deserved only poor reviews. He began to say that he was sorry it had turned out this way, and promised that it would never happen again. Jong Cheol, who was still a child back then, heard the boy ask him not to pay any attention to it all, and he thought that he would surely endure it all with pride, since it didn't bother him. Old Kimchi, at that moment, thought only that any words would be superfluous, for he existed solely to destroy Kratos, and always me too. But at that, he recalled what had happened before, even before he entered this game. Old Kimchi remembered the hand that commanded him to do this, and it was always 10. Even when he was clearing out demons, he always counted to 10. Even when he was just hanging around with nothing to do, he still did exactly the same thing. Old Kimchi was actually very surprised by what had happened, because he didn't understand why the hand that had commanded him to do everything had risen before him in the form of a demon. That is why he simply said that the demon must disappear from his presence, for his desire to destroy was far stronger. Immediately after that, he ordered his entire army to retreat quickly and flee with all their might. Without understanding anything, the army simply followed their commander's orders and began moving back toward their kingdom. But very suddenly, I slipped out of Kratos' grasp again and ran toward old Kimchi to attack him once more. Kratos was frightened but simply couldn't stop the plague, so literally in the next second, he was completely destroyed. But then the boy said he wouldn't do anything because it wasn't Kratos' will. The Yahello itself had decided to act that way. He only said that if he saw the horns of these demons on human lands again, nothing good would come of it and everything would end fatally. Sometime later, old Kimchi met with Asura and the others, and they began asking what had happened, as they were worried that the young man had disappeared so suddenly. The young man replied that he had simply stepped away for a moment to fight, but Asura was surprised to hear that he had intended to battle those demons, who were so terrifying. Asura Khan was truly surprised at that moment, for although he knew that Stare Kimchi was strong, he hadn't thought he'd have enough strength to fight the demon. After all, the boy had now, for the first time, avoided a life drenched in the blood of others. He had seemingly chosen the path of salvation, even though he had killed 2 people. Much later, Kratos knew that following the game's mechanics meant no glitches and no shortcuts, even though they would save time, so he decided he needed to return as quickly as possible to check the potato fields. Before long, the demon spotted an abandoned well and wondered how much it would have helped if the well had actually been working. These wells were essentially enhancement and teleportation systems, and he checked them just in case, but none of them worked. Kratos just sat down nearby and thought that it would be great to teleport right now, but he didn't believe for a second that he could pull it off. However, despite this, he managed to do it after all, and it turned out that the well wasn't broken after all, so after a while he teleported to where he needed to go. Meanwhile, much to their surprise, Kratos suddenly appeared right out of the ground, startling Flutie, who had been calmly searching for tools. She was so frightened that she simply fell to the ground after seeing him so unexpectedly. Meanwhile, Kratos was feeling very unwell because the teleportation had been so fast that he couldn't even walk properly now. After a while, he and his advisor arrived at the place where they were harvesting potatoes, and it was truly incredible because their supplies had now increased significantly. Kratos stepped closer, intending to take a look at the potatoes, but he couldn't understand why they kept rolling downhill all this time. Zephyros, seeing that his bishop was clearly worried, began to ask what had happened and why he was so upset. His lordship replied that these potatoes simply had no eyes, and therefore were practically useless. Zephyros realized that this meant the potatoes simply wouldn't sprout, and there was no point in keeping them here any longer. Despite the fact that they had planted these potatoes, nothing would grow from them because they lacked sprouts. Hartok explained that the nature of these potatoes had strangely changed, which led to mutations and the loss of reproductive function. So it turned out that they were inedible. But in response to Baal's words, Sergei replied that they simply couldn't be planted, but eating them was possible. Credo also replied that in any case, they couldn't rely solely on potatoes, since they could become the cause of other fields becoming infected. Now they would have to grow other plants, but Asura didn't know what else, besides potatoes could take root on their land. Despite the fact that nothing could really survive here, the protagonist said he knew of one place full of seeds, and it was on human lands. Baal began to argue that an invasion and theft could be tantamount to war, but Sergei told him to finally shut up, at least for a moment. At that moment, Kratos told his advisor to quickly prepare a massive amount of chuni. Hartoku was told to help the farmer's army, but Zephyros had to stay with him. Kratos added that in the meantime, he, Baal, Sergei, and Asurant would go ahead and sell the required amount, and then use the money to buy seeds. He knew that as long as they didn't run into old kimchi, everything would be fine, and there would always be at least some way out. Zephyros was actually surprised that their king was planning to go into the human world to sell all of this. And in fact, he considered it a bold decision, despite how it might seem. The advisor simply said that the king needed to take a closer look at the generals he was planning to take with him. He pointed at Baal, saying that no matter how you looked at him, he looked like a real monster straight out of the worst nightmares. Assurant was simply a walking red flag from a sane person's perspective. On top of that, he looked like someone who could take down anyone. Sergei, for her part, resembled a humanoid squid with pale skin. People would surely think these are demons, and then grab their swords, howl, and start attacking. Assurant and Sergei immediately started attacking him, even though he said he was just stating the facts. After all, this situation needed to be approached with a cool head. But Assurant replied that they were very rational and would turn him into sashimi right now, along with a human-like squid. But suddenly Baal chimed in, saying that they really did look very strange, and only he himself looked normal, even though Assurant added that it was the ogre among them who looked the way that would definitely make people afraid. Hartok sighed, saying he couldn't even imagine anyone having such a terrible opinion of himself, but they all just started to fade into the background compared to his own style. However, Assurant thought it was the style of a walking wrestler, or some kind of zombie. Only Sergei replied that they were all taking it too personally, even though she herself, the smallest of them all, looked the most human because of her many arms. Credo, meanwhile, sighed heavily, saying that everyone has a big ego and that the issue of appearance is very painful for everyone, so he even felt sorry for all of them. That's why he decided to lighten the mood a bit and said it was time to stop all this, adding that none of them was suitable for their parade. Even though they didn't look happy after that, at least he managed to stop their fight. The king turned to his advisor, recalling the item he had asked him to retrieve during the raid on Sarathul's castle, the one they'd found in the secret passage. Immediately afterward, he brought out some strange living thing that greatly surprised the other demons. Credo explained that it was an elixir of metamorphosis, and if they ate it, they would be able to transform into a creature that didn't resemble a demon. This would also allow them to change their appearance and enter the human world without any problem, without arousing suspicion. Baal went first, saying he wasn't picky, and tried to eat it, but it turned out to be incredibly delicious, so he spat the thing out. After the player took on a form that matched his inner nature, they could have moved on, but the protagonist hoped that at least there wouldn't be anything too aggressive there. Eventually, after some time, the ogre transformed into a more human-like creature, and could thus safely pass into the human world. Sergei decided to be next, and immediately grabbed the thing, intending to transform as well. She was a little surprised herself when she realized she had turned into a real Alp. In fact, she liked it, because she was a cold monarch and simply dreamed of becoming at least a little warmer right now. After that, the others also ate this thing one by one, and Assurant transformed into a bird, becoming a pelican. He longed for freedom after a long service as a lightning rod. Kratos also took one and became a troublesome student with no particular success in life. He just asked the others if he looked like someone with a sick liver, and immediately added that it was time to set off on an expedition. All of this happened just like in the game, because if you take a hit and use your skills, you can return to your original form, so you have to be very careful. After that, they used an abandoned well to instantly teleport to the land of humans, and fortunately, group teleportation can be performed simply by holding hands. Of course, everyone felt sick, but Kratos was already more or less used to this, so he immediately started thinking about how to get to the human realm and get past the fortress. He thought that, in the worst-case scenario, they might run into old Kimchi, but if they'd seen him last time, it meant he was heading deeper into human territory himself. A lot of time must have passed since then, and most likely he had already reached his goal and left the area. Kratos simply hoped that old Kimchi, whom he would inevitably encounter, wouldn't recognize him, and prayed that it would be so. Eventually, after some time, they moved on and found themselves near the fortress, where they were not greeted very warmly, as the guards assumed they were demons. Volkos immediately stepped closer and said that, judging by their appearance, they were from the outcasts' settlement, so he ordered them to turn back, since they had no right to pass through the gates. Credo had already considered that there had been a demon attack quite recently, so it was no surprise they weren't letting anyone through. But he was an experienced veteran and had read all the logs from the game's world history, and had done so several times. So he began explaining that he had returned from the demon lands just a few hours ago, to bring certain gifts. Kratos began to think that the King of Men would be very eager to find out what was there, and had even sent his own man to scout the situation, so he was confident they would be let through. Volkos asked if he was talking about the thing currently behind him, and Kratos didn't say he was wrong because that was exactly the case. He began explaining that there was a monster straight from the demon realm, since their meat is incredibly delicious and nutritious. Volkos, however, had only seen a giant and an alpaca, so he was surprised that Kratos wanted to bring ordinary animals as gifts. Actually, this didn't surprise me, since the world's level is roughly similar to medieval Europe, and in a place like this, an alpaca and a pelican can't be considered ordinary. Volkos replied that they were simply worthless, so he told them to take their animals and get out of there. The commander was also greatly surprised when the alpaca began to speak just like a human, so he stepped back. Kratos stepped closer, saying it was very good that he had noticed this, because this creature from the lands of demons really does speak human language wonderfully. As for the pelican, it was genuinely crying, though Azuran didn't know how to make it cry right now, even though it was his king's order. Realizing that these gifts could indeed be very valuable, Volkos immediately let them in, without a second thought. But despite all this, he said that they were still outcasts, so they were not allowed to walk through the kingdom without an escort. By a lucky coincidence, a royal messenger was heading to the capital right now, so they had to go with him. Everything was going very well indeed, and he had even begun to worry that he would meet the king empty-handed, since Azuran had returned from the lands of the demons with nothing. He explained that the royal messenger was traveling with his servant, so Jan Cheol revealed his real name and said he was from the village of exiles, after which he began naming his friends. Asrahan said that although he had lived there for some time, he had never once met this boy, or any of the others. However, Diol just began to say that the Lord had simply forgotten the faces of those he had met before. He told him to look at them more closely, and said that this was the very same boy from the second house on the left. At that moment, Diol suggested simply taking them along, since they would have a lot to offer the king. Azrahan dismissed the idea, saying he simply hadn't recognized the boy because they'd barely had a chance to talk there. Kratos, however, remarked that this boy looked a lot like a potato, though he had no idea where the boy had gotten the idea that he could use it. As for his servant Diawal, he was planning to squeeze every last drop out of him, and then toss him into a dumpster somewhere. The Lord then said it would be best to set off right away without further ado, but added that someone else would be joining them. Immediately after these words, old Kimchi came out to them, and they introduced the others to their new friend. Kratos barely managed to say his real name, because he started getting very nervous, and thought that this was definitely the end for all of them. Instead, old Kimchi merely remarked that this guy didn't look too good, and that he'd better take better care of his liver. Asrahan noted again that they shouldn't talk so much, since they needed to prepare for the long journey to their capital. Kratos stood behind them in surprise, unable to believe that old Kimchi really hadn't recognized him, but he thought that the metamorphosis potion had worked perfectly. Eventually, they began moving forward, but when night fell, they sat down and lit a fire to warm themselves and wait until morning. Kratos thought that the situation was critical, because if bandits attacked them, or they took even a single blow, the disguise would be blown the very same moment, and they would simply become pawns in old Kimchi's hands. He cautiously looked back, thinking that it was still a very long way to the capital, but they just needed to sell what they wanted and move on. Very suddenly, old Kimchi looked back again, and Kratos saw that he was staring right at him, which is why he began to worry that the old man might suspect something. He started thinking that just one glance seemed too terrifying, so he immediately began to calm himself down. Kratos also thought that they needed to escape as soon as everyone fell asleep, since they didn't have time to wait. In the end, That's exactly what happened, and the boy started waking Ball, but Ball said he needed at least a few more hours for normal growth, even though that period had long since ended. In the end, he managed to coax him along, and the four of them quietly prepared to leave the camp. Sergei asked where they were going so late, but Kratos was surprised that she could speak so clearly now, to which the alpaca replied that her throat had simply gone dry, which was why she hadn't been able to speak properly. In the end, he simply explained that they shouldn't stay here, since time was running out and they had very little of it left. The king said that their mission was incredibly important and valuable, but if they were exposed, there would be a lot of trouble. After a while, they saw old Kimchi in front of them. He had clearly heard their entire conversation and asked why they were so afraid to tell the truth. Meanwhile, Hartok and Zephyrus remained on their lands and continued to lead the farmer's army. The man said there had been no order for the other demons to gather here, so he was surprised to see them all nearby. One of the demons told him they had simply heard there was food here and had come right away just to get a little something to eat. Hartok just shook his head, thinking that they already had very little, and that they needed to at least wait for their king to arrive with new supplies before distributing food to others. However, more and more demons were gathering here, so they wanted to eat at least a little, and Planis's followers also arrived, claiming that they had no intention of attacking people. The Asura were also there, saying they'd traveled a long way, so they were very hungry and were demanding food right then and there. Hartok immediately asked how much of all this they had left, to which the advisor replied that there was very little. But despite this, they needed to be fed, and even if they were hungry, the question was how many more days they could hold out this way. Before leaving, Kratos said that Hartok would replace him while he was away, and ordered him to act and think like a demon king. That is why the man said they needed to divide the territory right away, with each group being allocated a separate small section, and he himself would make sure there was enough food for everyone. Meanwhile, the group couldn't shake off old Kimchi, who insisted he needed to find out what they were all hiding. Kratos began to stutter as he spoke about all this, though Ball didn't understand why his king was so worried. Old Kimchi wasn't the kind of person whose combat abilities were easy to gauge, and he seemed like a terrifying and powerful enemy to all of them. The boy thought about how his duty was calling him, and all of this had dragged him into that vortex of destruction and chaos from which there was no escape. But what worried him most was what Yang Cheol was about to do. He was very curious to learn all the secrets hidden in his heart, and it was then that Kratos spoke up, saying that they were not here for the king's gifts. He began to explain that it was very difficult to find food in their lands, but despite this, they were trying to farm, which was why they were here with a cart. Kratos explained that they wanted to sell at least something in order to earn money and buy grain and other vegetables. He added that they wanted to flee because they were afraid of being found, so they planned to simply bypass the capital and head to the nearest town. He added that he felt very sorry because he simply couldn't imagine how people were coping with this famine. So, Kratos decided to appeal to sympathy and pity so that they would understand him. Old Kimchi saw that this look was definitely hiding something, but he knew that this man was telling the truth, meaning that they had started attacking people precisely because they had no food, and not out of their own whim. He understood everything, but he simply couldn't let them run away from here. Old Kimchi said that the Lord had helped them, because he thought they were bringing tribute to the king, but he just couldn't let him feel that sense of betrayal. That's exactly why he offered an alternative and said they'd stop in the city, sell what they needed, and buy a few Zagran, but they'd still have to travel to the capital together. And of course, as agreed from the very beginning, those two would be given to the king as a gift. Kratos said he would definitely agree to that, since in their hometown these creatures were completely ordinary, and there were plenty of them there. Of course, he was well aware that things wouldn't go that way, since he planned to get the seeds and run away immediately. Asura asked to see what they were growing, and the man replied that there was absolutely nothing special about it, since it looked just like a giant potato. Azrahan and his servant began discussing that this was exactly what they could offer as a gift, since it looked much more interesting and valuable than those beasts. Though Kratos didn't understand why, in his view, it was a hideous and ugly potato. However, it was actually huge, though Kratos didn't understand what difference it made to him that this potato was many times larger than it should have been. Azrahan started laughing, saying that his servant liked it because the potato looked very much like him. And Kratos realized that they could have offered the strange potato to the king and received a good reward. However, they had a more important mission, to hide their identities from old Kimchi, so they wanted to escape before they were found out here. Before long, they had almost reached the trading city of Daparahia. Thanks to the generosity of Prince Azrakana, they and Baal were given one room, while old Kimchi's team received another. The beasts, of course, received absolutely nothing, and were left to spend the night outside. Kratos had never before imagined that a bustling trading city could have so many empty rooms, and such dreadful ones at that. But he personally didn't care about that, since they had come here solely to sell, earn money, and buy seeds. Asura approached the king, asking if he really intended to hand them over to the human king, but Kratos replied that it was just a cover for them. Meanwhile, Sergei saw something incredibly strange and said she had thought there would be a lot of people at the human market, but in reality, hardly anyone was walking around here at all. Besides, it was even more deserted here than in the demon lands, which seemed very strange to them. The protagonist also thought this was very strange and had pondered it the moment they arrived here, but he began to wonder if the economy in this city was simply terrible. Eventually, they arrived at the spot they needed, and after laying out their goods, began calling out to people, saying they were selling potatoes. They called out to absolutely everyone and tried to attract as much attention as possible in order to sell a lot of their goods. Ball, who was standing nearby, said he felt very awkward, especially after realizing that this man was their demon king, and he said this quite loudly. Kratos just told him to be quiet, because demons ate their own kind to escape starvation, and if they had to do this to survive, they simply had to be grateful for it. Ball, hearing this, also began to support him and call out to everyone else to attract more attention. In most stories, when people from the modern world are transported to a fantasy world and try to sell something, they immediately create something grandiose, like ice cream or food with MSG. But this was just a giant potato, and people might buy it out of curiosity, though they didn't know what would happen next. That's exactly why the main character was going to give it his all for his own survival and wanted to do everything in his power. Eventually, a man approached and asked if it really was that cheap, and Kratos began explaining that there might even be a small discount if they bought more. Hearing this, even more people gathered and started saying they wanted a lot, arguing over who would get more. Kratos was, of course, very surprised to see the whole crowd, as he hadn't expected things to go so smoothly. Sergei and Asura began saying they needed to move faster, since they really did have a lot of customers. Literally within a few minutes, they had already sold a third of their stock, and if this continued, they would be able to sell absolutely everything by tomorrow. The 4 demonic generals were due to return to the tavern soon, so Kratos told them he would return later, after buying the grain. Meanwhile, the young man went up to another man who was serving something, but his request surprised the vendor. The man began saying that it was impossible to find any grain anywhere in this city. Kratos asked again in which city they could find it, but it turned out that most of the grain had already been bought up by large trading guilds, so nothing was left. Kratos asked where the potatoes were now, but instead of answering, the man asked why his face was so pale. Only after a brief exchange did he say that Kratos could look back and ask the young man for more details. Eventually, a green-haired man approached and asked if they were the ones selling the potatoes. He said his name was Ruslan, and that he was the secretary of the Richmond Merchants Guild, and he also handled all their operations. Kratos said he understood everything, but didn't know why they needed him. Ruslan replied that he wanted to get down to business, and said he would buy all their potatoes at a price 20% higher than what they had set themselves. Of course, that sounded profitable, but he was more interested in how much the man was willing to sell them cabbage for, and the man paused for a moment. Ruslan smiled, saying that today's price was only 100 gold pieces per sack. Judging by the analysis of the markets in this world, the maximum price was 50 gold pieces. Yet here they were, charging twice as much. Kratos thought that these people were definitely speculators who controlled distribution, buying everything up, and then making a huge profit. In the end, those who got nothing had no choice but to buy everything from them, even though they didn't have enough money for toilet paper. The protagonist smiled, realizing that even if he sold everything, he still wouldn't be able to buy the grain at market price. But there was no rule forcing him to buy exclusively from them. Kratos also noticed that old Kimchi was watching his every move the whole time, and thought that the old man had sensed something was wrong after all. Then the Demon King finally found a way to get rid of this guy and also get the grains he had come for. He began speaking to Ruslan again, who said he wanted to buy absolutely all of their goods and added that they could talk right now. However, Kratos replied that he was just a rank-and-file member and doubted that he was capable of accepting such an offer, refusing to fall for their provocation. Ruslan grew nervous, saying that he was the head of the Merchants Guild and had every right to make any decision. Kratos then agreed, saying he wanted 200 gold pieces per potato and would only sell under those terms. It was clear from Ruslan's expression that he hadn't expected such a price, but Kratos continued to play to the crowd, saying it was indeed too expensive for someone like him. Kratos said that his boss must understand that large, processed potatoes, the kind that can be easily stored, cannot be bought cheaply, and that, in the end, he could hit the jackpot if he sold them to the royal army. And then he started asking if, by selling these potatoes 20% more expensive, a third party would get the contract to supply the kingdom, and who would end up losing, himself or the guild. That's exactly why the guy didn't call for his boss and added that he would only talk to him. Meanwhile, it started to rain. Assurant and Sergi, in the form of animals, continued to sit there, though Assurant was very angry at the Demon King for leaving them here. He didn't understand since when Sergi had become so devoted to the king, and she didn't seem angry at all about everything he'd dragged them into. The girl replied that ever since childhood, she had wanted to find out what kind of place this was, because they said that people had plenty of food and neighbors didn't eat each other, so for her, it was like a dream. And her parents had been eaten by a stronger demon, yet she didn't even feel sorry that they were gone, because to her, it already felt like a matter of course. She thought he must have felt the same way when his younger brothers and sisters were eaten. The girl replied that this city was much poorer than she had thought, but they didn't eat each other, and she had also seen something at the market. The father, who was very hungry, first gave this potato to his son instead of eating it himself. She wondered if their families could also live just as happily if they didn't have such problem. Assurant didn't answer that, except to say that when she feels strong emotions, she always forgets to add the pa at the end. Sergi replied that she had simply gotten used to that form and couldn't forget it. He tried to calm her down, but just then Kratos appeared and started shouting that they had a lot of work to do. Assurance suggested that it was all just a misunderstanding, since Sergi was simply too self-confident, but she, in turn, started saying that he was insulting her. Despite all this, the king simply grabbed them both and said they had a very important meeting of the four generals. Kratos reported that they were buying up absolutely all the supplies and then selling them at the usual price, and that this was, of course, very bad. Sergi asked why they were doing this at all, since there should be enough here for her, so it's unclear why they need to stockpile. Kratos explained that they're doing this not because they're afraid of starvation, but because they want to increase their profits and become even richer. Baal replied that he only knows basic needs, and those are met for him, while the hierarchy of needs shifts toward the increasing needs of specific people. Assurant realized that it wasn't just about needs here, it was simply plain greed. Sergi added that even though there are so many people in the city who need food, no one is giving it to them, and they still need at least a little money for it. Baal, listening to all this, was incredibly angry and didn't even know what else to say. But their king announced that the four demon generals must realize that such is the nature of humans, even if they are dissatisfied with it, and they themselves must act with a cool head and pursue their goals. Meanwhile, on their lands, Hartok stood inside a tornado and shouted loudly. The other demons were surprised, for out of the blue he had ordered a massive cauldron to be made, and had been summoning the tornado for quite some time. Only after a while did the man stop and realize that his resources were already dwindling. Zephyros quickly approached him, saying that he had been pushing himself too hard and needed to rest. Besides, he didn't understand at all why Hartok needed so much water right now. The man replied that so many demons had gathered here that it was hard to count them, and they couldn't feed everyone with just dried potatoes, so he'd decided to boil them in water. That was exactly why he was going to boil all those potatoes in hot water. He realized that with the same amount of food, he could feed a much larger number of demons. He believed there shouldn't be any hungry demons in these desolate lands, so he was doing everything he could to meet that need. Zephyros Hartok is truly doing a good deed, but his expression looks as if he's about to destroy everyone and everything here. Also, everything here began to change ever since the king told me that they would be farming. Cruel and cold-blooded Hartok began doing everything possible to obtain food for the other demons. Yet, he didn't know what had caused this man to change so drastically. Hartok himself thought only of you, whether he could gain even more favor if he did everything his master desired. The advisor also said that heating such a large cauldron would require a great deal of firewood, but he already knew that, and he added that it would be impossible to do so unless they defeated the lower-level demons. That is why they are now heading to the third star zone, toward the volcano, to capture the fire hunter. Meanwhile, Kratos and the others with him managed to meet with the head of this guild, whose name was Richmond. The man said that he had become disappointed in Ruslan and had expected much more from him. He also added that Ruslan shouldn't be intimidated by such tales from a strange boy, and remarked that he was too dim-witted to handle anything of greater importance. Richmond walked ahead, telling him to watch and learn carefully how to take everything from those who know nothing. He knocked on Kratos' door, saying that an ordinary merchant had come by, and adding that they wanted to meet with them in person, which was why he had come here. Richmond watched, thinking that these losers were completely letting their guard down in the face of this mask of politeness, and he didn't realize that this kindness was just a mask. However, when he stepped inside, he truly realized he was scared, for they seemed like some kind of demons. Richmond had no idea why they were all in this room at all. After all, there were animals here, though their faces looked very human. And there was another guy there, who was drooling even more terrifying. Richmond finally began to speak, though very hesitantly, saying that they wanted to ask for 200 gold pieces for a single potato. But Kratos said it wasn't 200, but 300, though Richmond replied that this was already too much. However, the demon immediately said that Lord Azrahan was with them, and he knew all about this. And ultimately, it was thanks to his family, who received orders directly from the royal family. And now was the best moment to demonstrate all his skills. After a while, the man came out and said they had agreed on 300, which greatly surprised Ruslan. Richmond said they had to take them to the mansion, and that separate rooms had to be prepared for the animals, since that was exactly what their contract stipulated. Of course, Ruslan objected, asking him why they should be so generous with such losers as them. But the commander replied that Ruslan's losses always ended up being many times greater for them, and he said that Ruslan really didn't understand a thing. Baal didn't get it, and added that it would be easier to wipe everyone out here and take the grain back to Kratos. He agreed that this was indeed completely his style, but there was something to the idea that they should avoid any conflicts and fights to maintain their cover, so the best option was to steal and run. To start with, he wanted to tell absolutely everyone about his plan, because this idiot needed 3 things to make a profit: a cover, a huge amount of capital, and a warehouse where he could hide the goods. Kratos said that right from the start, they would infiltrate the ranks and be able to find out where this warehouse was. At that moment, Sergei asked how he could understand human psychology so well, since he now seemed like someone who had lived among humans for a long time. However, they couldn't expect anything else from their king, though Kratos himself noted that idiots like them were easy to persuade into anything. Old Kimchi was standing near the door and overheard that they had decided to rob a man. They stayed at the Richmond mansion, where they were given luxurious rooms, and Lord Azrahan wondered how they had managed to get all of this. Kratos replied that he had simply sold her a giant potato, and then thanked them for even taking an interest in it. Azrahan had thought it was just an ordinary giant potato, but he couldn't even imagine that it was so valuable. He also added that it would be good if his servant were just like that potato. But Azrahan, dissatisfied with all his questions, replied that Diaol should get some sleep. Kratos, in turn, said that he would return everything, and that they needed to use it all up. Of course, Azrahan was initially against it, saying that he was an upstanding citizen and couldn't accept the fact that they would do this, even though Kratos hadn't counted on him. He only added that selling to monopolists in a city like this could only cause an economic crisis. That's why they agreed on something else, and after a while, Kratos went out into the yard and asked Ruslan if they were going to move their produce to the warehouse, since he wanted to find out where it was located. He immediately asked if Ruslan would mind him taking a look at their warehouse, since he wanted to make sure their potatoes would be stored under the right conditions. Ruslan replied that their warehouse was a confidential facility, but the demon wasn't about to give in. Even as Ruslan was saying something about the secrets of food storage, Kratos began to laugh openly at everything he heard. He then fell to the ground and started demanding that Ruslan show him the warehouse. After all, he had put so much effort into growing these potatoes and didn't want it to be in vain. A man standing nearby thought Kratos was feeling unwell, so he went to help him, but Kratos started screaming for no one to touch him. He began humming some strange songs, saying he wanted to see the warehouse. The 3 generals watched all this, not understanding what was happening, as they felt ashamed of their king. Azrahan was also surprised by all this. I thought that this was what a real end looked like because I didn't understand at all what was wrong with this guy. However, Diawal said that such a stance meant contempt for human dignity, all for the sake of achieving a goal, so he believed that he should learn to use something similar in his own life. Meanwhile, Kratos continued to hum all those songs, but the Lord thought about how he believed in Yan Chul, no matter what he was doing now. Earlier, they had discussed how all these crimes could be exposed, and he asked how long it would take to gather evidence and file a lawsuit with the kingdom's court. It turned out they would have to wait a long time, and that didn't sit well with him, because he couldn't accept the fact that ordinary citizens would go hungry. Kratos said he simply believed that Azrahan felt the same way he did, because they needed to join forces to restore justice so that people wouldn't go hungry. He spoke of how evil people had taken everything that rightfully belonged to the common people. In the end, the Lord acknowledged that Kratos' dedication to this cause was great, so he wanted to help with all the resources at his disposal. The protagonist said he would locate Azrahan's warehouse, and they would prepare absolutely everything he had asked for earlier. In the end, he just needed to locate the warehouse, but for a moment it seemed like it was all over. However, a moment later, it turned out that they had managed to get rid of that unpleasant man after all and could now move on. Credo was, of course, very pleased with himself, realizing that he had managed to pull it off. He used his skill and learned that Ruslan would be agitated for the next 7 hours and would head north from his current location to the warehouse. Old Kimchi, meanwhile, watched him closely, as he didn't know whether this whole affair was truly for the sake of justice or if there was another motive behind it. Hartok, meanwhile, entered the dungeon on his own land, and in a moment reached the grate. Zephyros emphasized once more that the Fire Eater was very powerful, so it would be better to bring a legion along, but the man replied that if anyone couldn't speak up, it was Zephyros himself. Hartok added that if they brought a group of weaklings along, the number of casualties would only increase, and nobody needed that. The man added that this was a job for the 4 heavenly kings, and only they could handle it. A short while later, he calmly walked on, thinking that this was so cool that the Lord would definitely praise him, and he was already calling himself a genius. He believed that the Fire Eater still had low intelligence, though he was very aggressive, and he also remembered that they had wanted to execute him for cannibalism, but because of his powers, they had simply had to lock the monster up here. Hartok walked even further, ordering the monster to appear, since a job had come up for him. And while the man was busy with this, Zephyros stood outside and played with T-Bone the whole time. Very suddenly, Hartok ran out from somewhere, trying with all his might to get as far away as possible, and told the younger man to run too, if he valued his life even a little. Eventually, the two of them, along with the dragon, began to flee from there, while the monster continued to chase after them. Hartok had entered the Fire Eater so confidently, but something went wrong. However, the man told them not to ask him any questions, for it turned out that the monster had grown significantly larger after eating so much lava. Zephyros simply said that Hartok, who had so confidently claimed he would lead them into battle, had now tucked his tail between his legs and was quickly fleeing from there. But those words stung him too deeply, so he decided to demonstrate his strength as one of the 4 generals. He was ready to sacrifice even his own life to achieve his goal. Using his own power, he managed to freeze the Fire Eater quite easily. Zephyros, who was still holding the dragon in his arms, said that Hartok actually looked a little embarrassed right now, but Hartok was against having that recorded. Credo and everyone else, meanwhile, were in their places, and they wanted to do all this so that ordinary citizens could eat properly. Azrahan stepped closer, asking why he was hiding his plan from old Kimchi, to which he replied that the boy had drawn too much attention, and, ideally, only the 2 of them were needed to carry out the plan. Finally, they set about executing it, and the protagonist rushed toward the warehouse as fast as he could. The plan was to take the grain while avoiding contact with old Kimchi, and of course, he was moving now, keeping him at the maximum distance possible. Luckily for him, the guy wasn't chasing him, so he wanted to get the operation done as quickly as possible to avoid failing it. Credo arrived at the location shortly after, thinking that security was top-notch at this warehouse, and realized that a fight was definitely unavoidable. After all, the downside of the metamorphosis elixir is that any blow causes the disguise to slip. If old Kimchi finds out, the plan will fail immediately. And just as the main characters were thinking about him, the guy appeared right behind him. Kratos was terrified and jumped back, though old Kimchi simply stepped closer, asking why he was so scared, and now his face looked even more terrifying. The boy asked if he really intended to share food with the citizens, and now just wanted to help. Old Kimchi replied that he had perfect hearing and could hear absolutely everything they were saying, even from several floors away. Credo was naturally surprised because it turned out that old Kimchi had clearly heard everything they'd discussed with the 4 generals, and all this time they'd been calling him their lord, which might seem strange. He said that nothing else mattered right now, because they had to give the food to ordinary people. Credo was just trying not to panic and thought that if this guy really had heard everything, he would have been turned into mincemeat here long ago. So he tried to calm himself down. After that, they started making excuses, saying they needed to confirm the route. But old Kimchi didn't understand at all why they were starting to hide their presence here. He added that it would be much easier to wipe out absolutely everyone here, and that's exactly what he would have done. After all, that's exactly what the protagonist had done before when controlling his character in the game. But at that moment, the demon said that life is a very precious thing, and it's better to choose another option to avoid unnecessary casualties. In the end, the boy couldn't disagree, and after a while they went even further, though the farther they went, the fewer guards they encountered. However, literally at that very moment, they saw a giant golem in front of them, walking and patrolling the area. Credo remembered that these were the monsters he'd seen in a gaming magazine, weapons created by the people of the Magic Tower. Also, in the game, they'd all already been destroyed, so they'd never appeared, which made him wonder just how strong these creatures might be. When old Kimchi stood up, Kratos began to worry, saying that they might make noise, and they needed to do everything much more quietly than usual. The guy just said that these monsters weren't really alive, so there was a way to solve their problem much faster, and that way the cleanup would go much quicker, and in the end, you couldn't help but agree with that. The two of them went even further, but at that moment, they saw an even larger number of golems controlling the situation in this area. There were 3 of them in this area, and if they were spotted, they would cause chaos, so the whole plan could go down the drain. Old Kimchi said they could check their route more than a dozen times, and when they appeared, there would be an opportunity to take them out one by one, starting with the one standing farthest away. Kratos recalled that the guy had recently mentioned he'd studied this, and it seemed that habit had stuck with him ever since he'd controlled him in the game. The old Kimchi said there were almost no places to hide here, and the only chance to move forward was to strike all these monsters at once. Kratos said he couldn't guarantee that, since he didn't know if he could destroy the golem with a single blow. He understood in his mind that he couldn't dispel the power of metamorphosis, because the mask would vanish. Then the guy handed him his staff, saying that even just holding it in his hands would make him feel significantly stronger. Kratos recalled that when he first found it, he thought it was just some kind of joke, but the more he learned about this thing, the more convinced he became of just how powerful it could be. He hadn't even picked it up yet, and his stats had already increased by 30%, so he could definitely keep fighting with this. But it also turned out that old Kimchi had saved absolutely everything he'd thrown into his inventory, so he pulled out a giant sword and was ready for battle. After that, the two of them rushed forward, though old Kimchi simply couldn't wait for Kratos, despite the fact that they had agreed to attack together. After a while, the guy moved closer to this golem with his own sword and was ready to attack it right then and there. At that moment, he was also about to strike, but Stare Kimchi beat him to it and struck first, though it turned out they were being too loud. Now the two of them were moving in perfect sync, which really surprised the main character. It wasn't the first time Kratos had noticed that their movements were literally identical to one another. Meanwhile, 2 more guards were passing by and noticed that the golems from this area had suddenly disappeared, even though they were supposed to be guarding this zone. At that very moment, Kratos and old Kimchi attacked these 2 guards simultaneously. The 2 of them moved as if they were a single organism, continuing to move as synchronously as possible. Kratos didn't understand at all why, standing next to such a terrifying monster, he felt so wonderful, and why the one who had taught him to destroy was now ordering him not to do so, because the one who had once desired chaos now wanted peace. But for now, being next to Kratos felt very good to him, and he felt happy, though he understood that even if he asked him, there was no way this guy would reveal his true nature to him. Kratos explained that, in this world, there aren't that many criminals who deserve execution, and perhaps they're just earning money to feed their own families. Or perhaps there were so many deep scars in their hearts that he didn't want to hurt them even more. They had already gone quite far, and hadn't encountered a single guard or golem, because, after all, they simply couldn't have imagined that anyone could get this far without making a sound. But suddenly they saw a huge door, and it was even bigger than that giant golem. Kratos said they needed to turn back and retrieve what they had prepared, but old Kimchi stopped him, telling him to wait a moment. Immediately after that, they saw Richmond approaching those creatures. They didn't let anyone else in, but when he got closer, he calmly stood before them. Then the man showed his ring, which allowed him to be let through. So the door opened before the man, and they were all let inside. Kratos saw all this and realized that getting inside would be much easier than he had planned. This warehouse was enormous, and inside there was as much variety of food as could possibly be. There were also rooms full of vegetables and fruits, and the condition of all these products was simply perfect. He also noticed that 3 golems were waiting together on one side, so he asked old Kimchi to deal with them in literally a single blow. Of course the young man managed to do this without any trouble, and there were no more threats or obstacles. Immediately after that, Kratos approached Richmond and grabbed him by the shoulder, though the man was very frightened, not understanding who else could possibly be there. He recalled those words about how there might already be deep scars on their hearts, and that Kratos simply didn't want to be the one to inflict even more pain. However, he certainly couldn't believe that this guy had been sane up until now. Before long, they found themselves inside the building with old Kimchi and tied Richmond to a chair, which surprised him. He had no idea what he was even doing there. Kratos asked if the man didn't recognize the place, since it was the very torture chamber he himself had built. The demon began to wonder why an ordinary merchant would need such a structure, but Richmond started making excuses, saying it was just a place for training. Credo had only just started mocking him when Richmond realized that he was facing someone who seemed ready to destroy him for any unnecessary word. He no longer fed the numbers, the ones that first cry, then laugh and say thank you. And the man didn't even understand what Kratos had been talking about all this time, since there was no telling what to expect from him the next minute. Kratos replied that old Kimchi shouldn't go anywhere, since he had to finish his business and then come back. Richmond laughed, thinking that they were simply underestimating the security system and would definitely not be able to get in anywhere. But it turned out to be much easier to do, because they simply took a small napkin with Richmond's blood on it. That's why the golem that recognized DNA let them in without any hesitation. Old Kimchi immediately destroyed the golem standing in front of them without a moment's hesitation. Richmond started to get genuinely scared, thinking this was some kind of crazy maniac paired with a fencer who took out almost all the guards in a flash. A little while later, the guys started heading back, but even though they'd secured Richmond, security measures would still be tight. But Kratos said they could do whatever they wanted now. While they were gone, the whole team kept promoting their products, saying that a sale was starting at the Richmond Guild's warehouse. Of course, at first people thought it was some kind of joke, since they didn't believe you could just walk in, take whatever you wanted, and leave peacefully. But Kratos assured them all that they could simply walk in and take as much as they wanted. Before long, there was a whole line there, led by the generals and their king. The guards standing near the warehouse ordered the golems not to let all these people inside. But Kratos said that Richmond had given permission to clear out the entire warehouse, and when he held out that napkin to the golem, the system naturally recognized the blood and granted entry. That's exactly why the guards were powerless against the crowd of all these people, and they could now do whatever they wanted here. Of course, they started rushing the shelves, trying to grab as much food as possible to take with them. Only Ruslan miraculously managed to find his boss and began telling him that the merchant had brought all the citizens of this city with him, and they were taking everything out of the warehouse. The young man added that they needed to activate the elite golems to protect their food and stop all those people who were taking it. But Richmond said he didn't want to spill rivers of blood because he just wanted to get rid. Ruslan was shocked. He had taken all the money from the citizens anyway, so this wasn't really any different from bloodshed, and he added that he wouldn't be sticking with Richmond now that he'd lost all his money. Meanwhile, the happy people were carrying out absolutely everything they could, and were overjoyed, because now they wouldn't have to go hungry. Old Kimchi, meanwhile, continued to fight with the security guards who were there. Credo thought that this guy was probably too busy defending himself, so they would be able to escape quickly and everything would be fine. Diaol and Alzrahan also fled almost as soon as he started talking about the people, which meant that none of them would be a headache for him anymore. But just then, he saw a giant boulder falling toward a mother and child, who were sitting defenselessly on the ground. Together, they thought the end had come, but suddenly Kratos and the other generals grabbed the boulder and held it for as long as necessary. Meanwhile, Ruslan vowed to destroy every last one of them in order to bring all the wealth back to his territories.